Chapter 238. Yi Haoran's lips were pressed together tightly, his expression grave. His sword was like a crowbar as he tried to pry at the incoming green jade sword. This green jade sword floating on the green jade mountain path gave him the feeling of a heavy mountain peak coming through the wind with peerless ferocity. His sword and the green jade sword met. Cries of surprise rang out from behind him. The enormous twisting shadow around his sword was almost tangible at this moment. It was a sky-blue serpent. The serpent was as alive as a living being, the scales on its body like glaciers that would not melt for tens of thousands of years. So this sword was the Cold Serpent Sword, one of the 10 famed swords of Chongling in the past. Just as the famed sword in his hand touched the green jade longsword, there was a light sound. The sword energy at the tip of the sword formed a circle, rapidly spreading in all directions. The green jade sword seemed to have no ability to resist. It spun backwards and bounced back many feet. Yi Haoran used the mountain prying sword form to pry away the attacking green jade sword. He did not feel any joy, but felt a dangerous presence. A shadow silently appeared in the faint green mist on the mountain path in front of him. Whoosh! That shadow suddenly pierced through countless clouds of light fog and attacked him. Yi Haoran's brow furrowed deeply. A pure sword will emanated from his sword and then disappeared without a trace. Countless threads of primal energies of the universe with a holy presence suddenly formed in front of him. In this moment, his movements were extremely simple. He just held his sword across his chest. Yet no one could see his sword. The primal chi of heaven and earth in front of him formed a circular light screen, like a translucent crystal disc. He seemed to be holding a crystal disc. Boom! A terrifying explosion resounded. It was as though wind and thunder had hit him. Yi Haoran did not move, but energy surged out of his feet as though the soles of his shoes were burning. Cries of astonishment rang out. It was only now that the people behind him could clearly see that it was another green jade sword that had pierced the light screen in front of him with astonishing power. Yi Haoran glanced at the green jade sword that was coming at him like a metal rod. The power of this blow was not enough to make him retreat at all. Yet he understood the connection between the second sword nucleus and this green jade mountain path. So he silently retreated. As he retreated, the faint mist on the green jade mountain path disappeared. The 2 green jade swords that had bounced out were pulled by a gentle power and floated back to their original places. The green jade mountain path returned to normal without any marks. This scene was unknown to the students who had just arrived, so they were even more astounding. Maybe I should try with you. Seeing Yi Haoran walk back, Ku Shichuan looked up and said. Yi Haoran did not seem to like Ku Shichuan from the start. He still did not look at Ku Shichuan, but shook his head and said coldly, "One person or two is the same." Ku Shichuan frowned. His cold gaze landed on the green jade mountain path. So there may be countless swords on this mountain path. Yi Haoran did not speak. His gaze landed on Zhang Yi and the others at the side. Other than just now when he was facing the 2 green jade swords, Zhang Yi and the others' gazes were on the sword nucleus covered in sword manuals. Even Ku Shichuan and I have interacted and tried before we were able to determine the meaning of this test so quickly. Could it be that you have completely understood the sword principle after taking a few glances at the sword embryo from afar? His gaze finally landed on Ding Ning, who was calmly closing his eyes and thought coldly. While Yi Haoran was looking at Ding Ning, someone was also looking at him and Ku Shichuan. The person looking at him was a handsome youth in white robes. He looked slightly older than Ding Ning, but younger than Zhang Yi and the others. His robes were pure white, but they shone with a cold light as though they were covered in a layer of frost. Regardless of whether it was when Yi Haoran stepped onto the green jade mountain path and was attacked by the two green jade longswords. Or now, his face was still as calm as water, but his eyes were filled with great confidence. Beside him stood a delicate and pretty young man and a simple and elegant young woman. The handsome youth was slightly shorter than him. His robes were pure black, but his sleeves and collar were dark red. The elegant young girl wore simple linen robes. The long sword at her waist was also simple and elegant. The handle was made of plain wood, and the sheath was made of light yellow bamboo. The handsome youth in white robes did not look at Yi Haoran for long. This short stare did not even attract Yi Haoran's attention. This should be the legendary Min Mountain Sword Sect's thought sword path. He turned and said softly to his two companions, one of Min Mountain Sword Sect's mountain protecting sword formations. But no one has seen the specifics before. Since it is a mountain protecting formation, it is not as simple as one or two swords. It should be thousands of swords, tens of thousands of swords. The elegant young girl glanced back at him and said softly, it should be energy sensing. How many swords will fly out for how many people come forward? But looking at the power of the swords, Min Mountain Sword Sect has done something to suppress the power of the sword formation, so that these swords are only equivalent to a Realm 3 Cultivator's sword. Or this sword formation has many layers, and only the weakest layer of swords are released. It is not so simple. Also, since they do not want that White Goat Cave youth to win, why are the previous trials focused on perception and comprehension? This White Goat Cave youth reached profound understanding in half a day and energy refinement in a month. He is strong in perception and comprehension. This seems to be biased towards him. Soldiers are unpredictable. Sometimes they should be hidden, and sometimes they should be revealed. Maybe after the Deer Mountain Conference, the Holy One feels it is time to reveal some of his power. Su Lianhua glanced at Ding Ning, sympathy flashing through his eyes. The palace can use the excuse of worshipping the crown prince to have Min Mountain Sword Sect agree to the conference being held early, but Min Mountain Sword Sect will not cater to anyone's wishes in the competition, because this is an internal matter of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Min Mountain Sword Sect will not allow anyone to interfere in the matters of the sect, especially when you know the personality of the sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Thinking of the many rumors about the sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Xiaowan and Chun Liqiu agreed. So, Chun Liqiu looked at Su Lianhua and said, perception and comprehension are the main focus at the beginning. Naturally, this cannot be the main focus later. Su Lianhua nodded. Of course. The competition of the Min Mountain Sword Trials will be different each year, but it will not be monotonous. Xiaowan sighed softly. The Min Mountain Sword Trials would become more difficult the further they went. What they were most skilled in had appeared at the beginning, and when they encountered what they were not skilled in, it would be even more difficult to win. Fighting is necessary. Su Lianhua paused, and then looked at Chun Liqiu and Xiaowan. He said, also, just from the previous events, this year's Min Mountain Sword Trials will take longer than in the past. So stamina, endurance, vital energy are all problems. Chun Liqiu frowned and said solemnly, so we cannot rush. Xiaowan glanced at him and said, it is not time to rush. There is no need to rush. Chapter 239. As the sky darkened, a young woman covered in blood walked past the first sword nucleus and then collapsed to the ground. She did not even have the strength to walk forward. Not far in front of her, there were more than 300 students gathered. Behind her, there were not many who persisted in front of the first sword nucleus. Among the thousands of students, there were many students like her, who had chosen the same method as Xie Changsheng to pass. But even so, only 300 people could pass in the end. There were so many people who saw the Tao, but couldn't go up. Many people were like this young girl with a strong smell of blood on their bodies. Therefore, although the scene was silent, there was a tragic atmosphere that constantly rippled. The sword moves inscribed on the second sword embryo were rarely seen in the world and were unusually exquisite. Most importantly, each sword mark was related to the sword moves recorded in these sword manuals. Through the thickness and direction of these sword marks, one could better comprehend the force exertion of some sword moves and the speed of drawing the sword. This was like some of the famous teachers of Min mountain sword sect teaching. Even if one could not enter Min mountain sword sect to study, the more one comprehended from these sword manuals, the more one's strength would grow in the future. So, no matter if it was Yi Haoren or Chun Liqiu who had followed Ding Ning and the others here, or those who had arrived last like this young woman, none of them were in a hurry to leave. No one went to challenge the green jade mountain path. Everyone was either standing quietly or sitting down to read the scriptures. They were extremely focused on comprehending the sword moves. Night fell. The night deepened. The darkness swallowed up the forest on the two sides of the green jade mountain path. The humidity grew and turned to dew in the mountains. Many students' hair and clothing were soaked by the dew, but they did not seem to know. All of their attention was attracted by these exquisite sword moves, and they even forgot the passage of time. As long as they could endure, most of them hoped to keep reading until they understood all the sword manuals and grasped all the sword moves. The sky in the east was slowly turning white. The night was about to pass. A student near the sword nucleus rubbed his eyes tiredly. He saw some white on the black sword nucleus. It was the beginning of summer, so it was naturally impossible for white frost to appear. Naturally, he felt that the sword was also covered with dew. But in the next moment, this student's breathing stopped, and his eyes widened. He suspected that he had seen wrongly. This was because the sword mark on the sword embryo was disappearing. Many cries of surprise rang out like a tidal wave, reminding him that this was not an illusion. Many students sitting on the ground stood up. The white essence on the black sword nucleus was fine dust, starting from the fine sword marks. The dust on the surface of the sword nucleus rustled down. It was like a wall that had been painted for a long time in a room. After the door had been closed for many years, it was suddenly opened. A fresh wind blew in, and the dust on the wall peeled off layer by layer. Seeing this scene, almost all the students were shocked, speechless. They began to understand that the sword force had already shattered the surface of the sword embryo into powder from the moment the person who had left the sword mark wielded his sword. It was relatively easy to cut or pierce through tough metal, but to shatter metal into powder, what kind of power was this? However, after a day and night, the sword intent had only appeared at this moment. What kind of realm was this? Min Mountain Sword Sect had set up many tents in the mountains. These tents could allow the officials and the cultivation teachers who had sent the students to rest. At the same time, these tents could allow them to see the process of the competition. Hearing the gasps from the mountain path, Palace attendant Rong, sitting in one of the tents, put down the teacup in her hand and said to herself with slight disdain, "Are they really not in a hurry?" Min Mountain Sword Sect naturally could not have the students stay endlessly in front of this sword nucleus. This setting meant that the time to study the second sword nucleus was limited to one day and night. This seemed fair, but in reality, it was extremely unfair. Because those who arrived later had less time to study, the young woman who had arrived in the twilight only had half the time compared to Zhang Yi and the others. From a certain point of view, Ding Ning's competition had won him more time. But starting now, the other students would start to compete. At the start, if Ding Ning wanted to be the first to pass, he would not have enough time to cultivate and replenish his vital energy. Even if he had a day and night, Ding Ning would not be able to replenish his vital energy. Also, she did not believe that Ding Ning could comprehend the sword manuals on the sword nucleus after just a short look. Now that the sword marks had disappeared and the sword manuals had turned to dust, it was too late for Ding Ning to look even if he wanted to. Stopping here is the best result for you. So palace attendant Rome could not help but murmur to herself. When one's mind was immersed in the sword marks and comprehended a section of the sword manual, it was very painful to be interrupted, especially when the sword move in one's mind that was about to take shape was suddenly interrupted, like the sword suddenly breaking. This feeling was even more uncomfortable. Yi Haoran was like this. When the sword marks turned to dust and disappeared, he almost groaned in pain. But in the next moment, he instinctively turned his head and looked at Ding Ning. At this moment, cries of surprise rose from the surroundings like a tidal wave. He saw dew fall off Ding Ning's eyelashes. Ding Ning opened his eyes at this time. Palace attendant Rong thought that starting from this sword nucleus, the other students would start to compete to win time for themselves. But at this time, most of the students had not recovered from the blank sword nucleus. Let's go. When he opened his eyes, Ding Ning spoke to Zhang Yi and the others next to him. Then he calmly walked forward. So he was still the first to start the breakthrough. At this time, the first light of dawn shone down. Everyone's gaze gathered on him. His body seemed to give off an inexplicable light. The scene was silent. All emotions were calmed by Ding Ning's actions. The last to arrive, the young woman whose clothes were covered in blood, had been filled with anger. But when she saw Ding Ning's calm back, she gradually forgot her situation and was completely absorbed. He seems to be very confident. Chen Liqiu blinked hard to ease the soreness in his eyes as he spoke. Su Lianhua thought and said, "They want to pass together." Xia Wan frowned and said gravely, "Let's see what they want to do first." Ding Ning was not the only one moving forward. Zhang Yi and the others, including the seriously wounded Xie Changxing, followed behind Ding Ning towards the green jade mountain path. In Xia Wan's view, at least one or two of these people would not be able to pass the following mountain path. But at this time, she found something she could not understand. These people seemed to be more energetic than the surrounding students. Ding Ning cultivated for a day and night. This day and night was like the deepest rest. He was full of energy and very normal. At this time, compared to the people around him, Ding Ning, who was covered in dew, was like a new lotus leaf after the rain, exuding vitality. But he was not the only one. Zhang Yi and the others seemed to be in a better mental state than the surrounding students. They were all comprehending the sword nucleus in front of them. So why were these people less mentally exhausted? She could not understand. So she felt that an accident would happen. The green jade mountain path was very wide. Zhang Yi and the others were very close to Ding Ning. So the group stepped into the area where Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran had sensed the strange presence at the same time. Ding Ning's expression was still calm. Zhang Yi and the others were even more nervous. There were many wild grasses on the two sides of the green jade mountain path. When Yi Haoran had stepped into this area previously, the green jade mountain path had risen with faint green mist. These wild grasses had only swayed in the wind. But when Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, and the others stepped in, and the green jade surface under their boots started to fill with green mist, many of the wild grasses on the two sides of the path suddenly snapped. Chapter 240. The sword moves of these 8 swords were unusually exquisite. Their flowing sword essences seemed to have been used by a swordsman who had practiced these sword moves for many years. Their power was astounding. Yet, to everyone's surprise, Ding Ning did not draw his sword in the face of these 8 sword attacks. He continued to walk forward calmly and confidently as though these 8 green jade swords did not exist. What was even more shocking and puzzling was that he was not the only one. Even Zhang Yi, Xiero, and the others did not attack. Only He Zhaoxi, Shen Yi, and Nangong Kaishu had drawn their swords. 3 sword lights jumped out to meet the 8 swords coming from all directions. He Zhaoxi, Shen Yi, and Nangong Kaishu were very nervous. The 3 of them were using sword moves that they had just comprehended from the sword nucleus. So while the changes in these 3 sword lights appeared exquisite, they were filled with unfamiliarity and sluggishness. How could these 3 swords stop the 8 swords with flowing sword essences? However, in just an instant, there were several rumbling sounds. The 3 sword lights were still shining in the air, and there were several light sounds in the air, as if something had been pierced. Ding-ning and the others were unharmed. The 8 green jade swords flew in all directions. Some of the green jade swords spun backward. Some changed directions slightly and slashed diagonally from the side of Ding-ning and the others, and some were like dragonflies that had lost half of their wings, stabbing into the air in a crooked manner. Primal energies of the universe drifted through the air like dust, rain, and snow. Many students could no longer control their emotions and exclaimed in disbelief, "How is this possible?" Xia Wan paled, her eyes filled with shock and bewilderment. Beside her, Su Lianhua was also stunned speechless. She instinctively thought back to every minute change in the 3 swords. Sword formation. It is a sword formation. Chun Liqiu said gravely. He did not have time to think about the changes in the sword lights, but he was certain that this was the only possibility. As Chun Liqiu's voice rang out, another 8 streaks of light whistled through the air, arriving before Ding-ning and the others. Ding-ning still did not draw his sword. Beside him, Zhang Yi and the others did not attack. The ones attacking were still He Zhaoxi, Shen Yi, and Nangong Kaishu. This time, there was a lot of popping sounds in the air, and a lot of bead-shaped energy that could be seen with the naked eye flew in all directions. However, the result was exactly the same. The 8 green jade swords scattered again. They used the sword moves from the same sword manual. At this moment, Su Lianhua finally recalled the general path of the 3 sword moves and said in a low voice, "Sword moves from the same sword manual." Xia Wan's right hand unconsciously landed on her sword hilt, and she gripped it harder and harder. She still couldn't understand. Chun Liqiu took a deep breath and furrowed his brows. "It really works." Behind Ding-ning, Xia Ro looked at Ding-ning's back, her emotions indescribable. She, Zhang Yi, and the others, including Nangong Kaishu and the other 2 who were attacking, finally believed that Ding-ning was speaking the truth. On the green jade mountain path, wind, frost, rain, snow, and lightning flashed. Green jade swords flew up and attacked Ding-ning and the others who were advancing on the mountain path. A sword that attacked was always faster than a sword that fell down. So there were swords flying around Ding-ning and the others, and sword lights attacking them. As Ding-ning and the others advanced, the number of swords around them increased, and the scene grew more stunning. It really is the same sword manual. Chun Liqiu turned slightly and asked Su Lianhua, "Which part of the sword nucleus is this?" Su Lianhua narrowed her eyes slightly and did not immediately answer. At this time, it was hard to see the figures of Ding-ning and the others who were surrounded by the flying green jade swords. Yet as He Zhaoxi, Shen Yi, and Nangong Kaishu became more familiar with their sword moves, numerous glowing ribbons of water appeared around them. These glowing ribbons of water were true water. If a sword light landed on them, it would create large waves. The 7th part of the sword nucleus. I have seen it before, but have not comprehended it. After a few breaths of time, he finally replied, "How is this possible?" Xia Wan's face grew paler. Her gaze landed on Ding-ning's blurry figure, and she repeated in a trembling voice, The dozens of sword manuals carved on the sword nucleus were all unusually profound and exquisite. A cultivator of ordinary talent would not be able to grasp one of these sword moves even after years of study. No one could comprehend all of these sword manuals in such a short time. Even a genius like her could only barely comprehend the sword moves of 2 sword manuals in one day and night. Ding Ning had not attacked from the start, but from his calm and confident expression and the reactions of the people behind him, Xiaowan knew that this was happening because of Ding Ning. But she clearly remembered that when she came here, Ding Ning had started to cultivate with his eyes closed. How long had he been looking at this sword nucleus? Half a cup of tea's time? No matter what kind of sword manual this was, how could it allow them to block the various exquisite sword moves of the green jade longswords with just 3 moves? Could it be that he was able to pick out such a sword manual from the sword embryo in such a short amount of time? Her ranking on the Book of Talents was much higher than Ding Ning. She had never fought Ding Ning before, but looking at Ding Ning's back, she suddenly lost confidence and felt cold. In the cold lands beyond the Great Wall, when a snowstorm suddenly descended, some wild beasts that could not get along would huddle together to resist the cold and pass through the snowstorm. When humans face strong enemies, they would sometimes be like this. At this time, Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoren were standing closer to each other. This is a sword manual with an extremely tight defense. Ku Shichuan looked at the mountain path and said softly to Yi Haoren, "But it is too soft, too slow. After leaving Min Mountain Sword Sect, it should not be of much use normally. So I just glanced and did not pay attention." Hearing Ku Shichuan's proud words, Yi Haoren said coldly with slight disdain, "Not of much use normally? It's too soft and too slow. It's only because of our current realm. If someone could attack as fast as the 3 of them, this sword scripture would probably be the sword scripture with the strongest defensive ability in the world." Ku Shichuan's expression darkened slightly, but he did not argue with Yi Haoren. He said slowly, looking at these people, "I fear they are just trying to comprehend this sword manual." When he said this, He Zhaoxi, Nangong, Kaishu, and Shun Yi had stopped attacking, continuously using their full power to deal with the attacks of the 8 swords naturally consumed vital energy and stamina. So the ones attacking now were Xie Rou, Xie Changsheng, and Su Heshan. Xie Rou and the other 2 were using sword moves from the same sword manual. The 3 sword moves created glowing streams of water. There seemed to be great gaps, but for some reason, they worked together seamlessly and blocked every sword that approached them. The green jade mountain path between the 2nd sword nucleus and the 3rd sword nucleus was not long. At this time, Ding Ning's group had passed more than half of it, so everyone was certain that they would pass through safely and at a small price. In the camp set up by Min Mountain Sword Sect, multiple middle-aged cultivators stood shoulder to shoulder. Their deep eyes were filled with disbelief. This is Cloudwater Palace's sword manual, Water Exquisite. They were all outstanding teachers of famous cultivation places. Their knowledge was much greater than the students. One of them sighed, softly. But even back in Cloudwater Palace, this was an unpopular sword manual. Even Bai Shan Shui did not seem to cultivate this sword manual. Who would have thought this sword manual would have such a change? Water Exquisite's profundity lies in the numerous glowing ribbons of water. These water ribbons themselves do not have much power, but they flow around the body in a miraculous manner. Moreover, these water streams flow in different directions. When the sword is among them, borrowing the movement of these water streams, it can move around as it pleases in an extremely short amount of time that ordinary sword moves cannot do. The other person slowly shook his head and said, "It's just that no matter how fast a sword is, it's impossible for it to protect the several feet of land around it. These 3 swords were used together, each using a different move. It's as if someone can use this set of sword moves at several times the speed. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe that a set of sword moves could be used to form a defensive sword formation. Does White Goat Cave also have Cloud Water Palace's sword manual? Someone looked at Ding Ning's figure and couldn't help but say softly, White Goat Cave cannot have this sword manual. Someone said, but these people could not hear these words, because the person who said this was currently standing in a green jade palace. This green jade hall was located on a cliff halfway up Skyscraper Mountain in Min Mountain Sword Sect. In Min Mountain Sword Sect, this place was a forbidden land for many Min Mountain Sword Sect disciples. The person who said this was a young girl wearing a green jade robe. She was at most about the age of Sierra. Her features were young, her chest flat, and her body clearly not fully grown. Yet she stood with her hands at her sides and had an indescribable presence. Water Exquisite is a secret technique of Cloud Water Palace. The jade that recorded the Water Exquisite was taken from the secret vault after Cloud Water Palace was destroyed and has been in Min Mountain Sword Sect. I personally chose and engraved this sword manual. But even I did not know this sword manual could be like this. How could I have leaked it in advance? Her eyes darkened as she spoke coolly to a young man dressed in green robes next to her. Chapter 241. Those who could stand in the forbidden lands of Min Mountain Sword Sect and watch the trials were naturally not ordinary people of Min Mountain Sword Sect. The young man beside the girl had a calm demeanor, but there seemed to be sword intent flowing out from his hair. It was as if any strand of his hair could kill someone. Hearing the young woman's words, he thought for a moment. Then he turned to the young woman and asked seriously, if it was you, could you pick out a sword manual like this in such a short time and comprehend such a method? No. The young woman shook her head and said. The young man shook his head and said softly, even you can't do it. Unless. The young woman frowned slightly. Multiple sword marks seemed to appear on her forehead. The young man stilled and wanted to speak, but she immediately shook her head and said, still cannot. She thought of a possibility. Unless she had seen the powerful cultivators of Cloud Water Palace use this sword manual with her own eyes and saw the many sword moves inside, and those sword moves were used quickly in a battle of life and death. Only then would she be able to connect the dots and do what this wine shop youth did in such a short time. But how old was this wine shop youth? Wei Cloud Water Palace had been destroyed before he was born, and the remaining great rebels of Cloud Water Palace did not cultivate this sword manual. In her view, this wine shop youth could not have seen this kind of sword move, much less seen someone use this kind of sword to recruit people in a battle of life and death. So she was not as good as him. She disdained to find excuses for her inferiority. You are in charge of the trials this time. If the first sword nucleus tested their foundation, and the second sword nucleus tested their comprehension, then what do you want to test with the third sword nucleus? The young man looked at her and asked curiously, what did you put on the third sword nucleus? In this young man's view, some things were more important than foundation and comprehension, such as resolve, a mature mind, and large amounts of battle experience. To his surprise, the young woman answered, I have them choose swords. Choose swords? As a swordsman, you must first have a clear understanding of yourself and know your strengths and weaknesses. The young girl was young, but she spoke like a teacher who had taught many disciples. Her tone was calm and unquestionable. If one cannot even choose a sword that can make up for one's shortcomings and greatly increase one's strength, then this person does not deserve to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. Hearing the young lady's explanation, the young man smiled bitterly and said, looks like you want this competition to be fairer. The students of different cultivation places came from different backgrounds, and the quality of their swords were different. For example, Yi Haoran's cold serpent sword was made from true serpent crystal. Just the power of the sword itself was enough to pose a threat to most students. If he could obtain a sword of the same grade as this deadly frost sword, at least he wouldn't be at a disadvantage in terms of external items. The following matches will be more interesting. The young woman nodded noncommittally and said coolly, "Use everything you can to grow stronger as quickly as possible. This is the quality a cultivator needs the most." The young man stilled slightly and then said with pity that these people from White Goat Cave only seem to have comprehended this sword manual. Everyone gave up on themselves so that this wine shop youth can win in the end. The young woman's expression grew stern, and she said seriously, regardless of the final result, these people, what they want to do, is worthy of respect. There were swords spinning and falling, swords floating in the air, but there were no more sword lights coming. Ding Ning passed this round. He looked at the third sword, Nucleus, not far in front of him. He stopped in his steps and was silent for a while. He knew that his performance at this time was shocking enough, even enough to make someone feel a little embarrassed. The settings of the previous two stages had given him enough time to replenish his Zhan Yuan, although the Zhan Yuan in his body was not abundant at this moment. In his opinion, the most difficult moment had passed. Just like now, the night had passed, and the morning sun had spread over all of Min Mountain. Yet, no matter how outstanding and perfect his performance, Xue Wangshu could not see him. He was no longer here. Everyone had to face life and death. People would encounter their friends and family leaving the world. He had endured this many times, but he could not help but feel sad. Junior sect brother, Zhang Yi sensed his silence. He understood why Ding Ning was suddenly silent. His nose started to sting, but he still wanted to comfort Ding Ning. But Ding Ning didn't give him a chance to say anything comforting. "Let's go," he said in a low voice, and then looked up slightly towards the sword Nucleus. Xie Changsheng panted as he held his sword. His internal injuries caused his lungs to burn and his blood and energy to roil unnaturally, but he was very excited and proud. He was certain that less than a third of the 300 students would pass this round. This way, he would at least enter the top 100 of the Min Mountain Sword Trials. He could not help but think of how happy his father would be when he learned of this news. What does this mean? But when he looked at the sword embryo in front of him and saw it clearly, he was stunned. To the Sword Valley, take a sword. There were also sword marks on the third sword embryo, but the sword marks only formed a simple sentence. Below these words was a map carved by the sword marks. "Leave this green jade mountain path, and not continue up." Zhang Yi also stilled. He saw that according to the map, they had to leave this green jade mountain path and walk towards a fork in the road next to the sword Nucleus. He was not sure if there was a deeper meaning here, whether the sword mark and the map had any special meaning hidden and it was not just the superficial meaning of the words and the pattern. Very interesting. At this time, Ding Ning said coldly. He started to walk towards the fork in the map. Then he said, "The person who set this up is very interesting and much more ambitious than Bailey Sushua." The Bailey Sushua that Ding Ning spoke of had an even louder title, the Master of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Is it not good to speak of the Master of Min Mountain Sword Sect like this here? Xie Changsheng felt that he was usually daring, but in Min Mountain Sword Sect, he could not calmly comment on the Master of Min Mountain Sword Sect. "Also, I do not understand what this means." He looked at Ding Ning and coughed softly. "Nothing much. It's just that we have to pick a sword ourselves." Ding Ning turned to look at him and said, "The sword manuals that Min Mountain Sword Sect casually threw out are more exquisite than the sect treasures of most cultivation places. The swords they casually threw out are naturally better than most swords outside. Xie Changsheng was shocked and said, "For free?" Ding Ning shook his head. "They cannot be so rich. At most, they will borrow it for the trials." Xie Changsheng immediately grew disdainful and said, "Then what is the meaning? If I have so many good swords, I can give them for free. If you become the master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, I fear that you will give away all 10 of Min Mountain Sword Sect's things," Xie Ro said disdainfully. Xie Changsheng naturally did not dare to argue with her, and immediately changed the topic. He asked, "Then why do we have to go pick a sword ourselves? What is the idea?" Ding Ning used simple words to answer softly, to make the following competitions fairer and more exciting. Some people do not have satisfactory swords. If a satisfactory sword suddenly appears, and it may have some unique abilities, then many possibilities will arise, and there will be more changes in battle. Ding Ning's explanation was clear. Xie Changsheng was shocked and said, "In other words, next will be a battle between students." Ding Ning nodded. Min Mountain Sword Sect is lending swords to fight, and not to cut carrots. No one felt that Ding Ning's joke was funny. If what followed was a series of battles, then there would be no trickery. Also, they had entered a mountain valley. This mountain valley was very barren. There were no trees, and wild grass grew everywhere. But at the center of the valley, there was an indigo palace. The indigo palace was very ordinary in style, like an ordinary Taoist temple, but it was very large and had a cold presence. According to the map, the sword that Min Mountain Sword Sect had prepared for them to choose should be in that indigo palace. Since we are taking a sword, we should go in alone to take it. Ding Ning suddenly frowned deeply. He sensed something and stopped. There is a formation. After Ding Ning stopped, Zhang Yi sensed something, and his eyes flashed with shock. What we see now is not real. Xie Changsheng and Nangong Kaishu exchanged a look. They had not sensed anything wrong, but from Ding Ning and Zhang Yi's conversation, was there a unique formation ahead? I am not sure what kind of formation it is. I do not know what kind of sword is inside right now. Ding Ning thought, and then turned to look at Zhang Yi. He said softly, "If there are Zhao Sword Furnace swords inside, you can choose a Zhao Sword Furnace sword." Zhang Yi stilled, and so did everyone else. You can choose an especially heavy sword, but if there is a small curved sword with a faint white blade and a silver hilt, or a wide sword with many square holes and coin-like patterns, you have to choose one of these two swords. Ding Ning did not explain and said softly to Nangong Kaishu, "Junior Sect Brother Shun, there is a small sword carved from black jade. There are seal scripts on the hilt that are dark blue. If there is one, you have to choose this one." Without any pause, he turned to look at Shen Yi and said, "If there is no such sword, you have to choose a lighter sword that can make your attacks faster." Chapter 242. Shen Yi and the others looked at Ding Ning like they were looking at a monster. They were so shocked they could not speak. This is just a possibility. There may not be the swords I speak of, but I hope you remember my words. If there are similar swords, do not mistake them. Ding Ning's expression was still calm. He turned to look at Xie Changsheng. You have to pay attention to see if there is a sword that seems to be made entirely out of crystal. Xie Changsheng frowned slightly and immediately asked, "Crystal?" "It's a rare kind of crystal. It looks crystal clear, but there are many natural golden threads inside." Ding Ning looked at him and said, "That sword looks like crystal, but it is actually made from a unique material. There is a three-legged golden toad pattern on the hilt. If there is no such sword, find a short sword that is completely blue. It is about 3 feet long and has no patterns. Even if you do not channel any vital energy into it, it will give off a layer of blue energy. If there is no such sword, then you can slowly choose." After saying this, Ding Ning turned to Xie Ro and said, If there is, you can choose a light purple sword. There are small blue seal scripts in the shape of lightning on the blade, or a sword that looks like an ordinary black iron sword, but the tip of that sword has very small holes. If you do not look directly at the tip, you will not be able to see them. If there are no such swords, you can choose a sword with a strong water presence. There may be a wide blue sword inside. That sword is a mother-son sword with a small sword embedded in it. If there is no such sword, you can find a long sword with red pine patterns. The blade is naturally hot, and you will feel slight pain when your fingers touch the hilt. Brother Sue, there's a sword that looks like it's made of snow and emits frost intent. That sword is the easiest to recognize. If there isn't one, you can look for a dark green sword. The runes on it are carved like willow leaves. If you don't have one, then try your best to choose a long and narrow sword. Without any hesitation, Xie Ro came down, followed by Hijiaoshi, and then Su Heshan. After speaking calmly, Ding Ning started to walk. Zhang Yi subconsciously followed him. Although Ding Ning's words to him were the shortest, they caused his thoughts to be in a mess, causing him to have too many questions. The Zhao sword furnace. Why did Ding Ning want him to choose a sword from the Zhao sword furnace? Why did Ding Ning feel that there might be a sword from the Zhao sword furnace here? Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew against his face. The next moment, Zhang Yi found that Ding Ning, who was in front of him, had disappeared. His body was swept up by an irresistible qi of heaven and earth and flew out in an instant. The scenery in front of him suddenly changed. Zhang Yi was usually very calm, but when he saw the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but let out an unpleasant cry like a chicken being slaughtered. There were no weeds, no temples. The weeds and green temples he had seen before had all disappeared. Around him was a barren land of yellow sand, like a desert. Yet this desert was filled with all kinds of swords. Tens of thousands of swords were stabbed into the yellow sand and stones. The sword lights emitted from the swords interwove into layers of light screens. It was as if there were countless prisms in the air, and countless reflections of himself could be seen in the prisms. Zhang Yi was shocked. He had never thought that there would be so many swords here. The edges and sword energies of these swords seemed to have cut his perception into pieces. The deathly still air was like sticky sugar water, trapping this world. He felt that cold wind was constantly blowing, but even the tiniest grain of sand on the ground was pressed down so hard that it didn't move at all. It was deathly and lifeless. The sword stabbed into the sand either straight or diagonally, resembling countless dead sword masters. His first feeling was that this was not a valley of swords, but an enormous sword grave, a sea of swords. His body and hands started to tremble. Then his gaze instinctively started to search for the swords of the Zhao sword furnace that Ding Ning spoke of. The Zhao sword furnace had many different kinds of swords, but only those furnace-like swords could represent the Zhao sword furnace. The Zhao sword furnace was just an ordinary smithing shop. Each of its swords had been personally forged by the Grand Master of Zhao Jianlu and numerous direct disciples. In the process of forging, a great amount of vital energy and primal energies of the universe had seeped into the swords, and the fire essence of the furnaces had been drawn in. So the representative swords of Zhao Jianlu, even if they had just fallen into the dust, would give off a great amount of fire energy. They were like furnaces giving off steam and fire. In a flash, Zhang Yi saw 3 crimson balls of fire rising in the world like 3 enormous furnaces. At this time, Zhang Yi started to understand where these swords came from, and why there was such an enormous sword grave in Min Mountain Sword Sect. He started to think the Qin dynasty's destruction of the 3 dynasties was such a grand story. In those past years, many powerful swordsmen had been killed in the few strokes of the history books. In order to kill so many powerful swordsmen, what kind of price had the Qin dynasty paid? How many cultivators and armies had died for it? The blood in his chest started to roil, his thoughts vast. Yet he still could not understand how Ding Ning had guessed that there might be such swords here. But after pausing for a few breaths, he began to walk towards the 3 huge furnaces. Many of these thousands of swords were famed swords that had been recorded in the records of the cultivation world. Many of them were especially attractive to cultivators due to their unique legends. But if Ding Ning had not told him to choose a Zhao sword furnace sword to carry, he might not have chosen any of the swords. He had a very powerful sword on him, and to him it was more valuable than any of the swords here. But the swords of the Zhao sword furnace were enough to command the respect of any cultivator in the world. So Zhang Yi respectfully approached the 3 Zhao sword furnace swords, and even bowed slightly. These 3 Zhao sword furnace swords were crimson red. They were forged from metal, but they looked like burning crystals. Even though the air in this sea of swords was as thick as sugar water, the burning heat from the 3 crimson swords still caused Zhang Yi's eardrums to ring. The swords of the Zhao sword furnace were all peerless swords, and it was hard to distinguish them. Zhang Yi did not hesitate. He sensed the temperature of the 3 swords and chose the one with the thickest heat. When he chose the Zhao sword furnace sword, Nangong Kaishu, who was also in the sea of swords, found it hard to choose. She was more shocked than Zhang Yi. There were too many swords in this sea of swords, but the 2 swords Ding Ning spoke of were present. She had found them all. The sword was a faint white, and the hilt was a curved silver sword. There was also a broadsword that was bronze in color and had many square holes on its body that looked like copper coins. These people's choices are very strange. The young girl in indigo robes could not help but say, the indigo hall she was standing on was on a cliff above the Valley of Swords. As the organizer of this event, she could clearly see the actions of any student in the Valley of Swords. Even when I entered this Valley of Swords for the first time, I could not help but wander for 4 hours in my shock. These swords are more attractive to swordsmen than anything else in the world. But their goal is clear. They seem to know what kind of swords are here, and they just want to find that kind of sword here. Why is this? She frowned deeply and asked the young man next to her. This young man was her teacher, but he could not give an answer to a question she could not understand. This matter should be related to this wine shop youth. She bowed her head and thought for a moment. Her expression suddenly turned cold, and she said, I only hope that he did not cheat, and that someone did not reveal the contents of the trials. Chapter 243. I want to see what sword he will choose. After saying this, her face became even colder, like the ice on the surface of a river in the middle of winter. Ding Ning looked calmly at this sea of swords, the grave of 10,000 swords, and was silent. There were countless good swords here, and many of them could be described as peerless. They would not be worse than some of the swords in Min Mountain Sword Sect's own sword storehouse. But because of their origins, they were placed here. Why is there endless war and killing? Because heroes are vying for supremacy, and the world is divided into 7 dynasties. Only when the world is united can there be no more years of war and killing. Yes, Ding Ning looked silently at this sea of swords. Such voices sounded in his ears like these 10,000 swords were speaking. The voices were filled with anger and disdain. They grew louder as though the masters of these 10,000 swords had come alive and were pointing at him and sneering. One person's thoughts cannot replace the thoughts of the world. Using stopping the killing as an excuse to create more killing is indeed wrong. Ding Ning took a deep breath and said softly to the 10,000 swords. Then he bowed reverently and turned to walk out. The expression of the young woman in green robes in the green jade hall froze. What does he mean? Does he not like even one sword? The young man next to her stilled. The young woman in green robes looked in shock at Ding Ning, who was walking out of the Sword Valley. She started to feel that her previous guess was wrong. "I want to see them closer." She took a deep breath and then said to the young man, "Thousands of swords formed a sea in the valley. The sharp killing intent and sword chi destroyed the ground, turning it into a land of death. However, looking in from the outside, it was still overgrown with weeds. A green hall was located in the middle of the valley, and there was not a single person in sight. The green weeds at the edge of the formation suddenly swayed, slightly. A footprint appeared, and Ding Ning's figure appeared out of thin air. He did not choose any sword, and just went in to take a look. So he was still the first to come out of the sword selection round. And first, call me when everyone is out." He used his last flower remnant sword to carve these words on the ground. Then he sat cross-legged on the ground and closed his eyes to cultivate. After a few dozen breaths of time, another footprint appeared on the green grass not far in front of him. The figure of a tall woman appeared in the air. It was Xiero. Xiero's eyes were filled with indescribable shock. After seeing Ding Ning sitting cross-legged on the ground, she calmed down a little, but her gaze involuntarily fell to her right hand. She held a pure black sword in her hand. This sword, in terms of appearance, quality, and weight, was almost the same as the most common iron sword in Chongling. If someone were to walk into the Valley of Swords and see the sword in her hand, they would definitely think that she had chosen the most ordinary sword. However, there was a row of fine holes at the tip of the black sword. Just like Ding Ning had said, if one did not look closely at the tip of the sword, they would not be able to see it. She did not know what sword this was, but this sword was one of the two that Ding Ning had specially mentioned to her. In such a sea of swords, this kind of pure black sword was the easiest to recognize. So when she saw the row of fine holes at the tip of the sword, as Ding Ning had said, she did not hesitate in choosing this sword. So she was the second to walk out of the sea of swords in a short time. She sat down next to Ding Ning to rest. After a few dozen breaths of time, a scorching aura suddenly appeared in the air. Zhang Yi, holding the sword furnace sword, appeared in front of her. Zhang Yi was still in shock, but he was the most polite. After bowing to Xia Ro, who had stood up, he looked closely at Ding Ning's surroundings. He even sensed what was inside Ding Ning's sleeve. Then he looked in disbelief at Xia Ro and asked, "He did not choose a sword." "I don't think so." Xia Ro shook her head and said softly, "When I came out, he was in meditation cultivation." Zhang Yi grimaced. He was a person who liked to use his brain, but when he was with Ding Ning, there were many things he could not understand. There really are swords from the Zhao sword furnace. Looking at Zhang Yi, whose body was half dyed red by the burning sword light, Xia Ro could not help but say softly. Zhang Yi's expression suddenly grew heavy. He said softly, "Most of the famed swords of the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties are inside." At this time, the grass behind him gave off a soft sound. Another person walked out of the formation. Zhang Yi turned around and saw that the person who had walked out was He Zhaoxi. He Zhaoxi held a wide blue sword in his hand. The blade of this blue sword was exceptionally thick and gave off the feeling of a horse-slaying saber. "This is a mother-son sword." Zhang Yi thought of Ding Ning's words and asked curiously. The swords of the Qin dynasty rarely had strange shapes. He had never seen a mother-son sword before. He Zhaoxi took a deep breath and nodded. He extended the blue sword in front of Zhang Yi and Xia Ro. "What is the use of this small sword?" Zhang Yi looked closely for a moment and found that the spine of this sword was a long and thin sword. The two seal scripts that looked straight were actually two grooves. He felt that this small sword could separate from the large sword along the grooves. However, this small sword did not have a hilt and could not be held with one's hand. Then was the use of this small sword just to be thrown at a certain time to injure the enemy? If that was the case, then this sword was too ordinary. What kind of formation is this? We can't even try it in here. How can we choose? Before Xiaoxi could answer, a depressed shout sounded behind him. The fierce-looking Xie Changsheng appeared in their line of sight. Be quiet! Fearing that Xie Changsheng would disturb Ding Ning, Xie Ro immediately scolded in a low voice. Then she asked with a cold expression, "What do you mean we can't try?" Xie Changsheng stilled when he saw Ding Ning closing his eyes to cultivate. Then he instinctively lowered his voice and looked at Xie Ro and the others. He said in puzzlement, "Did you not try the sword you wanted to choose inside?" Xie Ro shook her head and then looked at Zhang Yi and He Xiaoxi. Zhang Yi also shook his head. Then He Xiaoxi also shook his head. "Even if you do not suspect Ding Ning, do you not have any curiosity?" Xie Changsheng shook his head helplessly and said, "Inside, vital energy can be channeled into these swords, but the sword energy of these swords cannot be released. There is no way to try them inside." After a pause, Xie Changsheng said with dissatisfaction, "I originally wanted to bring both swords out, but I thought that the sword nucleus said to take one sword. If I brought both swords out, it would be like cheating in the casino. I may be disqualified from the trials. In the end, I gave up on that idea." "You found the two swords Ding Ning spoke of to you?" Xie Ro heard Xie Changsheng's meaning. Her gaze stopped on the sword in Xie Changsheng's hand. This was a sword that was very standard, but it was a crystal sword made of extremely special materials. The blade of the sword was sparkling and translucent, like a pure crystal. However, there were countless natural golden threads within the blade, and the golden threads on the hilt flowed to the surface, forming a pattern of a three-legged golden toad. The two swords were not far from each other. I found them almost at the same time. Xie Changsheng nodded and answered, "So you found it hard to choose between the two swords?" Zhang Yi looked in shock at the sword in Xie Changsheng's hand and asked, "Then why did you choose this sword? You have not seen that short blue sword. If that short blue sword and my sword were placed in front of you at any other time, you would definitely choose that short blue sword, because that short blue sword is so sharp that even the sword energy can hurt people. In comparison, this sword looks too weak, as though it could be easily cut apart by that sword." Xie Changsheng flipped his left hand towards Zhang Yi and said, "If Ding Ning had not mentioned my sword first, I would not have chosen this sword." There was a bloody mark on Xie Changsheng's left palm that was still seeping small beads of blood. Sword energy can hurt people? Zhang Yi, He Xiaoxi, and Xie Ro all inhaled sharply. Xie Changsheng sneered and said, "My palm was an inch away from the edge of the sword when I was cut." "What sword is this?" Xie Ro couldn't help but wonder if Xie Changsheng was speaking the truth. "The name of the sword is not important." Xie Changsheng shook his head and looked at Ding Ning. "What I do not understand is why Ding Ning felt that there would be such a sword here. Did he know there would be such a sword see inside?" "The sword is the Xieji sword, made from the horn of the Xieji, and comes from the former Zhao. But I also do not understand how he knew there would be such a sword here, and how he knew there would be such a sword see inside. So he must explain it to me." A female voice sounded from the back, but everyone immediately knew it was not Nangong Kaishu. Nangong Tsaishu's voice could not be so cold and authoritative. Zhang Yi shook and turned around. He saw a young woman in blue robes appear in his sight. Then his eyes felt a stabbing pain. At this time, a young man whose hair seemed to flow with sword energy appeared behind the young woman in blue robes. Chapter 244. Xie Changsheng's face suddenly turned snow-white. Even when he had been seriously injured by the first sword nucleus and coughed up blood, he had not felt much terror. But the moment he saw this green-robed young woman, he felt terror from the bottom of his heart. This kind of terror came from animal instincts, and not from the difference in strength. It was like an adult male sheep would still feel fear when seeing a young wolf. He had seen countless young talents before, but had never felt such a feeling. What kind of terrifying monster are you? Looking at the green-robed young woman, he immediately thought of this. In the next moment, he thought of a possibility, and his body started to freeze. Xie Rou and He Zhaoxi were not much better off than Xie Changsheng. The only one who could move was Zhang Yi. Because he was a man of etiquette, he bowed to the green-robed young woman and the young man behind her, even though he was terrified in this moment. "Excuse me? I am Jing Liuli," the green-robed young woman answered directly. The green-robed young woman replied very directly. She did not care at all about the great waves her simple and crude reply caused in the hearts of these people. "So you should know that I have the right to have him explain to me." The young woman looked coldly at Zhang Yi and said. Zhang Yi could not express any objection. The name Jing Liuli did have the greatest right. Even if she was not in Min Mountain Sword sect, her name had enough right to ask many people to do many things. From the first year of Yuan Wu to now, she and Baosher of Lingshu Sword Gate were thought by everyone to be the strongest cultivators of the Qin dynasty in the future. In other words, if nothing unexpected happened, this green-robed young woman in front of him would be the future successor of Min Mountain Sword sect, the next master of Min Mountain Sword sect. At this time, this green-robed young woman had the dignity of a sect master. Zhang Yi slowly nodded. He was about to turn around, but Jing Liuli, the most famous young woman in the world, stopped him. "I can wait." She glanced at the words beside Ding Ning and said, "Before this matter is resolved, in order to ensure the fairness of this competition, you don't have to wake him up now. You don't have to interrupt his cultivation. You can do as he said and wait until all of your people come out before you wake him up." Her words were very fair. Zhang Yi and the others were speechless. At this moment, a burst of biting cold inexplicably appeared in the air. White frost suddenly appeared on a patch of grass at the edge of the magic array, and then Su Hashan's figure appeared. He held a pure, white sword in his hand. It was the color of pure snow, as if it was a sword made of snow. However, the sword was constantly surrounded by ribbon-like icy air. No snow could produce such a coldness. When he saw Jing Liuli, Su Hashan's body immediately froze. This is the Cold River Thousand Snow Sword, the life-bond sword of a former academician of the Wei dynasty. While it has lost its life-bond energy, it is the coldest sword in the Sword Valley. Jing Liuli said coolly and didn't even turn to look at Su Hashan. Su Hashan had come out, and only Nangong Kaishu and Shun Yi remained. This sword is called Twining Branches of Hatred, the sword of the master of the Han's Thousand Lotus Palace. Jing Liuli continued without stopping. Before she finished speaking, Shun Yi's figure appeared. In Chun Yi's hand was a sword with a glossy black jade-like luster, and the hilt was covered in a dark blue twining pattern. After saying this, Jing Liuli seemed to know that Nangong Kaishu would not appear soon, so she stopped. "Then what sword is mine?" Xie Changsheng could not help but speak. He felt that his terror was very cowardly. He spoke now because he wanted to shake off this terror. "One sword illuminates 19 cities. This is the brilliant light sword of the former top general of the Zhao dynasty, Zhao Qua. However, when it appears in his hand, it always shines brightly. Very few people can see the true form of this sword." Jing Liuli glanced casually at Xie Changsheng. She seemed to see Xie Changsheng's thoughts, and a hint of disdain appeared at the corners of her mouth. Xie Rou gritted her teeth. She also wanted to know what sword she held, but she instinctively felt that the more she asked, the more disadvantageous it would be for Ding Ning. At this time, Jean Liuli looked at Xie Changsheng and slowly said, Nangong Kaishu is slow because she finds it hard to choose like you. She wants to choose between the fish intestine sword and the gold sword. She is more careful than you. Now, she has chosen. She has chosen the fish intestine sword. For some reason, hearing Jing Liuli's cold and calm words and seeing the faint disdain at the corners of her mouth, Xie Changsheng felt angry and embarrassed. What sword is the fish intestine sword? He said angrily. You must not have even heard of this sword. The masters of these swords died in battle before you were born. Many of the masters of these swords were powerful, but they were not famous until they died. They are rarely recorded in the records, so I do not understand why he would let you choose these swords. Jing Liuli did not answer his question. Her gaze moved to Ding Ning, her expression growing colder. Then she said, You can wake him up. The grass at the edge of the formation gave off strange sounds. Nangong Saishu's figure appeared. Jing Liuli did as she said. After everyone finished choosing their swords, she would wake Ding Ning up. Zhang Yi struggled to swallow. Then he reached out with his left hand in an unusually stiff posture and patted Ding Ning's shoulder. Ding Ning's eyelashes fluttered. His eyes opened. The green-robed young woman's brows unconsciously furrowed deeply. Ding Ning's gaze immediately landed on her, but Ding Ning's expression was still calm. I am Jing Liuli. She stared into Ding Ning's eyes and said word by word, You must answer some of my questions. This will determine if you can continue to participate in the Min Mountain Sword trials. Ding Ning looked silently at Jing Liuli. Now that he had seen the girl in the legends, he was sure that the rumors were true. Sensing this young woman's presence, he was certain that even in the strongest era of the Bazin Kendo ground, if this young woman had been born in that era, she would have had a place among the top experts. Jing Liuli's eyes narrowed slightly. She was not used to people being so calm in front of her, and not used to people not immediately answering her. Just as she was about to speak again, Ding Ning nodded. How do you know these swords? Why do you feel that the Sword Valley may be a sea of swords like this? Did someone leak all the contents of the Min Mountain Sword trials to you in advance? If so, no matter what status that person has in the Min Mountain Sword trials, they cannot protect you. Jing Liuli spoke with a cold expression. Hearing her words, even Xie Changsheng started to suspect that someone had leaked all the contents of the Min Mountain Sword trials to Ding Ning in advance. This was because Ding Ning's previous performance could not be explained by any reasonable reason other than cheating. But Ding Ning started to explain. He said calmly, I know these swords because I spent a long time with forefather Zhou. I heard him speak of countless famous swords of the past. These swords are just a part of them. Jing Liuli's expression grew colder. Forefather Zhou was an old man of Chongling, but no one could test if he knew these swords, especially now that he was dead. Any explanation that pushed the blame onto a dead person would not be convincing. But she did not immediately speak because she wanted to see how Ding Ning would answer her next question. That was a truly difficult problem to explain. I feel that the Sword Valley may be such a sea of swords because of the second sword nucleus. Yet Ding Ning did not pause and continued calmly. Jing Liuli's eyes flashed. She immediately said, What does it have to do with the second sword nucleus? The sword manuals carved on the second sword nucleus do not look like the sword manuals of the Qin dynasty. Thinking of how Min Mountain Sword Sect has never revealed any sword manuals before, and how these sword manuals are so profound and exquisite, I think that these sword manuals can only come from the cultivation places of the 3 dynasties destroyed by the Qin dynasty. They are the things of outsiders, and it does not matter if outsiders see them. Ding Ning looked calmly at her and said, Everyone has a weakness, including the person who arranged the Min Mountain Sword trials. I want to win this sword trial, so I will study the person who arranged the Min Mountain Sword trials as an enemy. I want to see if this person has any pattern in his conduct, since the second sword nucleus is filled with things from outside. I think this sword selection may also be filled with things from outside, since the sword manuals on the second sword nucleus are so exquisite. I think with this person's conduct, the next sword selection in the Sword Valley will naturally be astounding swords. So I feel that there may be many famous swords from the 3 dynasties, but I had not thought that there would be so many swords and such a sword grave. Hearing Ding Ning's calm narration, Jing Liuli's eyes showed true shock. The question she found hard to answer came from such a reasonable deduction. Even more importantly, she was the person who arranged the Min Mountain Sword trials. As Ding Ning said, was Ding Ning able to do this because of some weaknesses in his personality and conduct? As long as it was a weakness, it could be exploited. So she was truly shocked. Chapter 245. If you suspect me of cheating, then ask who in Min Mountain Sword sect knows about these arrangements. If it was me, I would not think that anyone from Min Mountain Sword sect would help me cheat because they would not gain anything from me. Ding Ning turned his head and looked at the tents on the distant slope. He said in a calm and cold tone, I am just an ordinary White Goat Cave disciple. Jing Liuli looked at the dots of white in Ding Ning's hair and was silent for a moment. Then she asked, why did you not choose a sword in the Sword Valley? This is a private matter. Ding Ning turned his head and said to her. Jing Liuli said, this is the last question I will ask you, and you can think of it as a private matter. There are many reasons for not choosing the swords inside. Ding Ning did not insist. He looked at the remnant sword at his waist and said, for example, a personal matter. This sword was given to me by a teacher in the sect and is of great importance to me. For example, the problem of using the sword itself. You should know that I am not the strongest in vital energy among these students. If I want to win, I cannot rely on vital energy and the power of the sword itself. Even if I can find an extraordinary sword, they can also find other extraordinary swords. In terms of power, I still have no advantage. If I want to win, I have to rely on the sword itself. So, I need a sword I am most familiar with. Hearing Ding Ning's understanding, even the young man behind Jing Liuli was shocked. He was shocked that Ding Ning had such comprehension at such a young age, and even more shocked by Ding Ning's confidence. You want to use the use of sword moves and sword essence to win against your opponent. Jing Liuli nodded. The frost on her face had completely disappeared and was replaced by a strange light. Ding Ning nodded and said, having great strength does not mean being able to fight. This is a simple truth. You are right. I hope you can win in the end. After saying this, Jing Liuli turned, and her figure disappeared into the air of the valley. While everyone knew it was because of the formation, they still felt it was unreal. For someone like her to appear in front of him, it was already somewhat unreal. Especially the last sentence she said. It felt even more unreal. People like her did not need to be fake. She said she hoped Ding Ning could win in the end. This meant she really admired Ding Ning. The young man with sword intent flowing all over his body smiled apologetically at Ding Ning and the others, as if he was apologizing for wasting their time. Then, without saying anything, he turned and disappeared. After his figure disappeared for a long time, Zhang Yi finally refocused. He looked at Ding Ning with a happy gaze and said in a trembling voice, Junior sect brother, even Jing Liuli hopes you can win. You are really amazing. After saying this, he felt it was not right. He took a deep breath and said, my junior sect brother is amazing. Regardless of whether you can win in the end, senior sect brother will be proud of you. This is not the time to be jealous and proud. Let's go. Someone has caught up. Ding Ning looked back and said emotionlessly. Then he started to walk. It is Yi Haoran from Li Lingjuan's residence. Looking at the white figure that appeared in their sight, Nangong Kaishu said gravely, maybe we should leave one person behind to see how they perform when they pass that sword path. It is not very useful. That sword path is not a true threat to those ranked in the top 20 of the Book of Talents. It cannot force them to show their true hidden power. Ding Ning did not even turn his head. It is a waste of time to see it. Jing Liuli passed through the Sword Valley and walked to the other end. Her footsteps gently stepped on the yellow sand, but it caused many swords in this Sword Valley to tremble. The young man behind her suddenly frowned and said in a deep voice, "You have a fighting spirit. Do you actually think that he will be your opponent?" Intuition is hard to say, especially when you know that my intuition is very accurate. Just like when I first saw in Baosher. And Baosher was just a child who had not started to cultivate, but I felt that he would be my opponent in the future. She did not even look back and said slowly, "This wine shop youth gives me the same intuition. But the prerequisite is that he must survive because he does not have much time left." Was that person really Jing Liuli? After following Ding Ning for many steps, Xiat Chongsheng still had a disbelieving expression and became even more joyful. I actually saw Jing Liuli. Xiat Ro rarely saw him like this. Her expression immediately darkened, and she said, "Look at you. Just now, you don't even dare to breathe. What are you so happy about?" Xiat Chongsheng stilled, and then said angrily, "This is Jing Liuli." "Then what is there to be happy about?" Xiat Ro looked at him and said, "You are so happy just to see her. Do you count as a man of the Xia family?" Xiat Chongsheng grew even angrier and said, "Then what can I do? Can I marry her?" Xiat Ro did not look at him and said, "I'm afraid you don't even dare to think about it." If it were any other day, Xiat Chongsheng would not have argued with her. But today, Xiat Chongsheng felt as if his scar had been exposed. He shouted angrily, "Why wouldn't I dare to think about it?" When he said this, Xiat Chongsheng suddenly felt the surroundings were deathly silent. Even Ding Ning paused in front of him. Everyone looked at him strangely. Even Zhang Yi looked at him strangely. "What are you doing?" Xiat Chongsheng's face suddenly flushed red as he shouted. Zhang Yi was a gentleman. He realized that he had been rude. Seeing Xiat Chongsheng shout at him, he felt that he had to respond. So he hesitated and said awkwardly, "Marrying Jing Liuli, you dare to think about this?" "Xiat Chongsheng, you are very impressive." Xiat Chongsheng's expression froze. Shunny looked at him. He wanted to laugh but did not dare to. Zhang Yi said sincerely, "People do have to set goals for themselves. The higher the goal, the greater the achievement." Su Hashan and Nangong Kaishu looked at Xiat Chongsheng with sympathy. Xiat Chongsheng stilled and did not speak. He lowered his head and followed Ding Ning with a dark expression. But after walking dozens of steps, when everyone thought the matter was over, Xiat Chongsheng suddenly looked up and said angrily, "No one said that a man must be of higher cultivation than a woman to marry her. So what if I set her as my goal?" "You are serious?" This time, even the most taciturn He Zhaoxi could not help but look in shock at him. Xiat Chongsheng looked angrily at him, as though he did not want to answer his question. He Zhaoxi was slightly embarrassed and said, "But you have to like her, you cannot sulk." Xiat Chongsheng grew even more furious. "You think she is not good-looking. How is she not outstanding?" He Zhaoxi was speechless. Jing Liuli seemed to be very good-looking. If she was not outstanding, then who was? However, this seemed a little too absurd. If I can make people look at me differently just by setting her as my goal, why should I not do it? Xiat Chongsheng recovered his usual demeanor and snorted coldly. Amazing! Zhang Yi once again praised sincerely. As they spoke, they had reached a cliff on one side of the valley, according to the diagram on the third sword nucleus. There was a narrow path between the cliffs. After passing through this narrow path, the view in front of them suddenly opened up, and an even bigger valley appeared. Facing them were several simple huts made of wood. They were similar to the residences that some farmers in Chongling used to raise chickens and ducks. The aroma of food came from these simple huts. They had not eaten for a day and night, so the aroma of food was very tempting. But Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, and the others continued to look behind these simple huts. Behind the simple huts was a vast flat ground. Countless people's footsteps seemed to have rubbed against the ground here, so the ground was as smooth and hard as though it was covered with a layer of stone. There were sword marks on the ground. The flat ground was divided into many areas, and each area looked the same size. Do the students who arrive here fight in the areas divided by the sword marks? Nangong Kaishu took a deep breath and could not help but say softly, so old-fashioned. Very old-fashioned, but very practical. Ding Ning walked into the simple hut. The food in the shabby shed was also very practical. An iron pot on a large stove that was still emitting steam was filled with white rice, while the other two iron pots of the same size were filled with large pieces of braised pork and the most common boiled vegetables. Chapter 246. Usually, the fatty red braised meat and the light boiled vegetables were the best accompaniment. They were food that appeared in the meals of ordinary people in Chongling. Especially when one was hungry, this combination and the steaming white rice were filled with indescribable temptation. These meals were naturally for the students who arrived here. There were clean bowls and chopsticks on the simple wooden table in the hut. The sword marks on the wooden table formed an unusually simple word for use. It seems not bad. There is no need to fight on an empty stomach. Xiaoxi's stomach rumbled as he said with some shame. His work and rest schedule in Green Vine Sword School was extremely regular. He had 3 meals a day on time. This way, he could ensure he was in the best state to cultivate each day. After not eating or drinking for a day and night, he finally realized that the effect of hunger on him was greater than ordinary people. Zhang Yi and Shun Yi were used to taking care of Shui Wangshu in Falling Parasol. At this time, they naturally and skillfully scooped rice for everyone. They placed the braised meat and vegetables on top of the rice, and then drizzled some soup over it. The first bowl was habitually given to Shui Wangshu. This reminded Zhang Yi that Shui Wangshu had passed away. Zhang Yi's eyes turned slightly red. This bowl is for Cave Master. So he sadly bowed his head. He put the chopsticks on the first bowl of rice and placed it at the head of the table. Xie Chong, Sheng didn't want to think too much about these heavy matters. Instead, he glanced at the bowl of rice Chun Yi handed to him. Looking at the oily meat on top of it, he casually said, "This looks a lot like the last meal in prison." Nangong Kaishu heard this and said helplessly, "Can't you say something more auspicious?" Eat, eat. Xiaoxi was extremely hungry. He did not care about his image and started to eat. Ding Ning also picked up a bowl of rice, but after taking a bite, his brow imperceptibly furrowed. The taste of the food was very good, and there were no problems with the texture. However, the countless invisible little silkworms in his body had already reacted naturally, becoming restless. The 9-death silkworm he cultivated was the most profound method in the world. His perception of the body was many times stronger than most methods in the world. So in the next moment, he felt some presences that were detrimental to his body spread through his body. There was clearly something wrong with these dishes. They contained some kind of strange poison. But why was there a problem with the food prepared by Min Mountain Sword Sect? Ding Ning put down his bowl and chopsticks. He looked at He Zhaoxi and the others who were eating happily. He thought of the appearance of Jing Liuli just now. His eyes flashed, and he maintained his silence. The braised meat and vegetables were very appetizing. He Zhaoxi, who had the best appetite, finished a bowl in a few moves and quickly started on his third bowl. "Junior brother, you should eat some too." Zhang Yi saw Ding Ning stop eating and thought that Ding Ning was sad. He could not swallow and stopped to comfort him. Ding Ning glanced at him, shook his head, and did not speak. Zhang Yi felt even more sad and found it difficult to eat. At this time, Ding Ning suddenly looked up towards the side of the hut. Zhang Yi did not know why Ding Ning would do such a thing. He instinctively looked up and followed Ding Ning's gaze. Then he was shocked. Under the eaves of the hut, dozens of feet away from him, and Ding Ning, an indigo figure, had appeared at some unknown time. This was also a young man wearing a green jade robe. Compared to the young man who had followed Jing Liuli, this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator standing under the eaves close to them had an ordinary appearance. Even more importantly, he did not have any sharp sword essence. Even now, he did not sense any presence belonging to a cultivator from this young man. If he took off the indigo robes that represented Min Mountain Sword Sect, he feared that this young man would not attract his attention as he walked through the streets of Chongling. When Zhang Yi saw this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator, who had suddenly appeared and was stunned, Xie Chongsheng and the others discovered this person's arrival and put down their bowls and chopsticks. "Why are you not eating?" This ordinary-looking indigo-robed man did not care about their gazes and asked Ding Ning. His voice was very ordinary, his tone calm, and without any special characteristics. Ding Ning glanced at him and said calmly, "Do not want to eat." "Why do you not want to eat? Is the food not good?" The indigo-robed man asked with unusual friendliness. Nangong Kaishu suddenly felt cold. This indigo-robed man gave people the feeling of a chef in a restaurant asking about the taste of a guest's dishes. Ding Ning did not immediately answer. "I am the best cook in Min Mountain Sword Sect, and I think that my food tastes better than most restaurants in Chongling. Even more importantly, I have not personally cooked for many years." The indigo-robed man looked at the bowl of food in front of Ding Ning and said, as he spoke, his tone was still gentle, like a chef in a restaurant asking for a guest to give him some face. He moved his chopsticks. The taste of the food was exceptional. Even though the rice had been warm for a long time, it was still just right. There were no flaws to be found in the braised meat. But hearing his words, even Xie Chongsheng thought of something terrifying. His face turned green, especially He Zhaoxi, who had almost finished his third bowl of food. He Zhaoxi felt his stomach twist. "You are Elder Gungrun?" Nangong Kaishu suppressed the shock in her heart and asked. The indigo-robed man looked at her humbly, nodded, and said, "This one is Gungrun." He Zhaoxi's stomach twisted, and he started to feel nauseous. Xie Chongsheng and the others also began to feel fear in their hearts because the person in front of them was the legendary human chef. In the past wars between the Qin dynasty, the Han, Zhao, and Wei, Geng Ren of Min Mountain Sword Sect had been a student like them. But even so, this Min Mountain Sword Sect student had left behind many records. He'd once assassinated a few important generals of the Darkhan dynasty, and there was once when he hid in a military camp of the Darkhan dynasty that was filled with tens of thousands of soldiers for over 10 days. In the end, not a single person in the military camp noticed his existence, and when he finally succeeded in his assassination and left, no one noticed his tracks. However, the most shocking record about him was that he first disguised himself as a Han cook in Ditua City, and then was recruited into the army as a cook. Then, he used poison to kill over 1,000 people in one go, incurring the wrath of the Han dynasty's famous General Han Song. He sent out 5,000 elite cavalry troops and several dozen cultivators to chase after him, forcing him all the way into the Han northern lands. After a great snow sealed off the mountains, the Han army used 3,000 elite infantry troops to cooperate with the cultivators to chase after him. However, in the end, it was Gung Ren who survived, while more than half of the 3,000 infantry troops and several dozen cultivators who surrounded him died. After the mountains in the north of the Han were sealed, there was very little food. In order to cut off Gung Ren's source of food, the Han army had killed all the small animals and useful plants that the infantry had passed. The small teams that went into the mountains to search each day would first eat their fill and then not bring any food with them. In some records, Gung Ren had survived by killing enemies and taking their leg meat. Although Gung Ren had not personally confirmed this kind of helpless act of survival during wartime, it gave Gung Ren the nickname of Human Chef. But what was certain was that Gung Ren of Min Mountain Sword Sect was a powerful assassin. He was not just a swordsman, but also a master of poison. A person like this was a true legend to the juniors of Chongling. Xie Zhangsheng had never thought that he would actually meet another legendary figure here at this moment. It has nothing to do with taste, but Ding Ning was still calm. He shook his head and said, "Then you must eat a bowl." Gung Ren shook his head helplessly and said, "Because there is poison in the food." Zhang Yi, Xie Changsheng, and the others immediately changed expression, telling people there was poison, and then forcing them to eat. What did this mean? Was this person one of the Empress people and could control Min Mountain Sword Sect? But Gung Ren continued humbly, "Because this is the rule of the trials. Originally, I did not need to say anything because I felt that cultivators under Realm 7 would not be able to detect my poison. I am confident in my cooking and taste, but I had not expected that after starving for a day and night, there would be people who did not want to eat my food." After saying this, he shook his head sullenly and said, "What kind of logic is this?" Xie Changsheng and the others were speechless. They all felt that Gung Ren's words should have been spoken by them because poisoning was the rule of the trials. To poison them? What kind of logic was this? This is not an ordinary poison. Gung Ren glanced at everyone and slowly explained, "This is the 7-leaf powder, a poison recipe of the former way. The medicinal power of the 7-leaf powder is very unique. When cultivators are poisoned, there will be no reaction. But when they fight, their vital energy will flow violently. The medicinal power of the 7-leaf powder will affect the blood and internal organs in the body. It will bring great pain and cause many of the body's functions to be out of balance. It will make people feel as though they have been poisoned or seriously injured. So this 7-leaf powder is also called the 70% powder. This means that cultivators who have been poisoned can only use 70% of their power. If they go over, their body will not be able to withstand it. What kind of logic is this?" Xie Changsheng could not help but shout. Thinking of how he had been poisoned, he shouted with a black face, "What kind of freakish sword trial rule is this? I did not set this rule, but I agree with the logic." Gung Ren smiled unconcernedly and said, "Most of the battles a cultivator experiences in their life will not be when they are in their best state. Many times, they will fight when they are injured. So fighting in this state has more practical meaning. Also, controlling one's vital energy, controlling one's body, how to conserve vital energy, this is the so-called freedom of control. If one cannot even sense one's injuries, how much power they can use and how to fight for as long as possible when injured, then this cultivator does not qualify to be a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect, or even enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, because Min Mountain Sword Sect wants swordsmen who can truly fight and kill, not sword dancers who only know how to use sword moves." When he said this, Gung Ren had some pride on his face. Chapter 247. Then what if I did not care about the medicinal power of the seven-leaf powder and fought with my full power? Would you not save me and let me die from the poison? Xie Changsheng looked at Gung Run with an ashen face and shouted, "If I really am poisoned to death, who will take responsibility for this? The seven-leaf powder will only cause the body's functions to become chaotic, but it won't directly poison a person to death. If you really don't care about the seven-leaf powder's poison and forcefully use your true essence, then at that time you will be able to experience the pain of those terminally ill people who are dying." Gungren was not angry at all. Instead, he found it amusing and laughed. The various pains at that time are not something that can be endured with a moment of bravery. Moreover, you let the poison take effect. When the time comes and you are killed by a sword during the competition, no matter how you want to settle the score, it will not be my fault. Xie Changsheng said angrily, "If I am killed because of the poison will be given. How can it not be blamed on you?" Gungren smiled slightly and said, "I am only following the orders of my sect. If you want to blame, you can only blame Min Mountain Sword sect. I am not the strongest in Min Mountain Sword sect. Even if the sky falls, it will not be my turn to hold it up." Xie Changsheng was speechless. The strongest in Min Mountain Sword sect was naturally the sect master of Min Mountain Sword sect. But in the rumors of the world, while the sect master of Min Mountain Sword sect loved peace and never left the mountain, he was an extremely petty, protective, and vengeful person who dared to find the sect master of Min Mountain Sword sect for revenge. Soft chewing sounds sounded at this time. Xie Changsheng turned in shock and saw Ding Ning had picked up his bowl and started to eat. Just like how Ding Ning usually ate in Falling Parasol, Ding Ning seemed to be eating with relish. Gungren looked at Ding Ning. He still had a warm smile on his face, but his eyes showed undisguised admiration. The Min Mountain Sword Trials was a great event for everyone in Min Mountain Sword sect. Naturally, everyone in Min Mountain Sword sect was paying attention to the progress of the trials. He admired Ding Ning's previous progress. But even if he admired him, even with his status in Min Mountain Sword sect, he could not pass the trial and directly grant Ding Ning the right to enter Min Mountain Sword sect to study. Sometimes rules were rules. Without rules, there would be no order. Seeing Ding Ning start to eat, Xie Changsheng could not get angry even if he wanted to, but he was still unwilling. He turned to look at Gungren and said, "Even if the medicinal power of this seven-leaf powder is very unique and everyone can only use 70% of their power, those with higher cultivation can use 70%. Those with lower cultivation can also use 70%. Those with higher cultivation still have a great advantage over those with lower cultivation. What's the point of weakening someone of the same level?" "What? Don't tell me you want to take away his natural advantage in cultivation?" Gungren seemed to find Xie Changsheng more and more interesting. He could not help but laugh. "Then what's the point of some people working hard? Everyone doesn't have to work so hard to cultivate their Zhen Yuan. You don't have to use your Zhen Yuan to fight." Xie Changsheng stilled and could not find words to refute. Gungren looked meaningfully at him and continued, "Moreover, it is 70%, but can everyone grasp it so accurately? Fighting after using the seven-leaf powder is a game of ordinary people blindfolded walking towards the edge of a cliff. The closer they are to the cliff, the more benefits they will obtain. But if they cross the line, they will fall off the cliff and die. Some people, for safety, will walk less and stay further away from the cliff. Then they can only use 50 to 60% of their vital energy. Some people are daring and walk a few steps closer to the cliff. Maybe they can surpass 60%. As to 70%, it is too difficult for you." Xie Changsheng's expression grew uglier as he listened, but Zhang Yi grew more respectful. Hearing this, he couldn't help but bow to Gung Run and said, "Sir, your explanation is very detailed. We have benefited greatly. Thank you, sir." Gung Run bowed warmly in return. If he had not revealed his identity, no one would connect him to the terrifying human chef of the legends. Xiaoxi picked up his rice bowl again. He had a large appetite to begin with. Now that he knew that the 7-leaf powder was not a poison in the ordinary sense, the food became sweet and delicious in his eyes. However, he still had some misgivings, so he put down the bowl and asked respectfully, "Sir, is there a difference in severity between poisons from the 7-leaf powder?" "Actually, if you eat half a bowl, it is the same no matter how much you eat. To be on the safe side, I want to personally see each of you eat a bowl. The poison of the 7-leaf powder is very interesting. It doesn't matter if you eat more. After all, it's not the kind of medicinal power that kills. After a few days, the poison will naturally dissipate without leaving any traces." Gung Rin patiently explained again. They had to eat, but it was fine to eat more. Also, the braised meat and vegetables were delicious. Since a legendary cultivator like Gung Rin had personally cooked, everyone ate in peace. "Is it really fine to eat more of this 7-leaf powder?" A moment later, Xie Changxing's face suddenly changed as he cried out, "Why is my stomach hurting?" Hearing his cry, the others immediately became nervous. However, Gung Rin only glanced at him indifferently without any change in expression. "I haven't eaten for a day and night and ate 4 bowls of rice in a row. My stomach is naturally bloated and painful." Xie Changxing immediately froze. Nangong, Kaishu, and the others wanted to laugh, but could not. There's still enough time. There shouldn't be any problems when the next competition starts. Zhang Yi looked at Xie Changxing seriously and consoled him. "Senior, are we going to wait for all the students who can reach here to arrive before starting the advancement test?" At this time, Ding Ning suddenly interrupted. "It shouldn't be so simple, right? HM?" Gung Rin made a sound of surprise and turned his head in surprise. He saw Ding Ning looking calmly at the fields divided by sword marks. His eyebrows rose, and he asked, "Why do you feel that it will not be so simple?" "Previously, when I saw the setup here, I thought that the next would be a practical one-on-one promotion competition. But Elder, you are an additional obstacle." Ding Ning looked back at him and said calmly, "Since Elder said that Min Mountain Sword Sect only needs people who can use the sword to kill and not sword dancers, and Elder also said that most of the battles that cultivators experience in their lives are not fair one-on-one fights after both sides have rested, but sudden battles. Many of them are being chased, or fighting for a long time on the battlefield, or even fighting for a long time after being wounded, or being chased or trapped after being wounded. To get close to this situation, it is not enough to limit vital energy to a few tenths." After a pause, Ding Ning said, "Since they sent someone like Elder and spent so much effort to make food and poison, they cannot just go through the motions. So I feel that it will not be so simple. Maybe it will make us truly tired and even wounded." Gung Ren's appearance was very ordinary. His expression had been very ordinary since he appeared, but when he heard Ding Ning's words, his expression suddenly grew solemn and flashed with strange light. "Your conjecture is correct, because the person in charge of the trials is also a genius, and geniuses usually pursue perfection and extremes." He looked solemnly at Ding Ning, nodded, and said seriously, "Those who attend the trials, especially those who can reach this point, are naturally 1 in 10,000 geniuses. But the more outstanding a genius is, the fewer battles they have been defeated in before. Many of them may have never been seriously wounded, but for a cultivator, being wounded is an important experience. Some people are terrified when they imagine having a dozen bleeding wounds and having to continue fighting. If they really encounter a situation where they are stabbed in the stomach, they may not even be able to use any of their power much less try to survive. Most young people understand that bravery is important, but they do not understand what true bravery is because they have never experienced a situation like this. Looking at Xie Changsheng and the others who were completely pale, Geng Ren added. His expression was solemn from beginning to end, because he saw Ding Ning's talent in a different light, and even won some of his respect. He, like Jing Liuli, hoped that Ding Ning could win in the end. So his words were not idle chatter, but true teaching, like a teacher passing on his experience. Zhang Yi could sense it, so he also had a serious expression and prepared to bow in thanks. However, Xie Changsheng did not accept this kind of kindness. He shouted with a cold face, "Who came up with such a perverted idea? Do you really want to stab us in the stomach next? How many times you will be stabbed will depend on you." Geng Ren was still not angry. He admired Xie Changsheng's straightforwardness. After speaking calmly to Xie Changsheng, he turned to look to the side. This valley was originally just a vast expanse of flat land. However, at this moment, an enormous green shadow slowly appeared in the air. A large indigo palace seemed to appear out of thin air and sat in a corner of the mountain valley. The mountain valley they had passed before had also had indigo palaces, but they had been illusory, yet all of them were certain that this one was real. This was because other than the color and reflections being more realistic, this green palace had a real smell. Moreover, there were many strange and irregular sounds inside that could not be simulated by arrays at all. Chapter 248. The people of Min Mountain Sword Sect were honest and would not play tricks. So even without Geng Ren's words, everyone knew that the final event before the competition should be in this green hall. What is inside? Xie Changsheng looked at this green hall and felt the skin on his stomach grow colder, as though he had been stabbed by a sword. He gritted his teeth and turned to ask Geng Ren. Geng Ren shook his head and said, "Seriously, I cannot tell you what is inside ahead of time. But just now, I have told you that you will be very tired after entering, injured, and maybe stabbed many times. So you have the right to choose to give up." Xie Changsheng was furious. "Bullshit. We worked so hard to get here, and you want us to give up? Do you know how much silver I spent to get a spot in the trials?" Zhang Yi looked helplessly at Xie Changsheng and said softly, "Sir has good intentions." Geng Ren was not angry at all. He smiled faintly and said, "It's fine. It is indeed not easy to spend money to buy a spot and eat a bowl of my cooking here." Xie Changsheng said angrily, "Not just one bowl, I ate 4 bowls." Geng Ren looked at his bulging stomach and shook his head. He said, "Then you have to be careful. Otherwise, if you are pierced and the food flows out, I fear you will not have an appetite in the future." Xie Changsheng's chest rose and fell violently. "As a senior, is it not boring to threaten me?" This is the sincere suggestion of an elder. Geng Ren looked seriously at him and said slowly, "Some cultivators really have the experience of having their abdomen pierced after eating a full meal. That kind of scene, even if one does not fear death, will affect one's appetite. Even after a decade, one will involuntarily think of that scene when eating, especially when the food you eat is not good to look at, but it flows out of your stomach." Xie Changsheng suddenly froze. Geng Ren's tone was still calm, but he could hear the deeper meaning within. People who had not seen that scene with their own eyes would not describe it in such a calm and sincere tone. No matter who it was, to be able to survive after being pierced in the abdomen in an extremely difficult situation, it was very impressive. After freezing for a few breaths, Xie Changsheng took a deep breath and bowed slightly to Geng Ren. He said in a deep voice, "I admire you." Geng Ren glanced at him and seemed to think that he was the one who was truly bored. "Sir." Zhang Yi hesitated for a moment and said. He looked at Geng Ren with even more respect. Geng Ren looked at him. Zhang Yi pointed at the Green Palace and asked, "When are we going to enter that palace? Are there any requirements for entering and exiting that palace? Actually, I don't even know what's inside the palace." Geng Ren looked gently at Zhang Yi and said slowly and clearly, "I am only responsible for letting you in one by one, but I can guarantee that the arrangements inside will be absolutely fair to all of you. As for the time to enter, it will be 15 minutes after you eat my food. So, you only have a little time to prepare." Zhang Yi hesitated for a moment before asking, "If what Mr. said is true, and we are all seriously injured after entering, and we still have to wait for the people behind us to enter the next competition, wouldn't it be unfair? Maybe you will bleed more, or you will have more time to treat your wounds." Geng Ren said calmly, "As for the specifics, it will depend on your own ability." His words were clear enough. Zhang Yi even felt that if Geng Ren did not admire Ding Ning enough, he would not have spoken in such detail. While the choice to advance and retreat is difficult, when to advance and when to retreat, you really need to consider and grasp it well. Geng Ren looked at Ding Ning and said. Ding Ning looked at him and said calmly, "I choose to enter." Geng Ren did not speak further. He looked calmly at the path Ding Ning and the others had taken. The mountain valley was quiet. Only the echoes of footsteps could be heard. Moments later, a white figure appeared in front of everyone in the hut. Next, it was Yi Haoran, who finished choosing his sword and followed Ding Ning and the others. Ding Ning looked calmly at Yi Haoran, who was slowly walking over. Yi Haoran still held his cold serpent sword. He did not have any other sword. He had not spent much time in the Sword Valley. Even if he had chosen a sword, it would be a small dagger. Geng Ren looked up slightly and waved his hand at Ding Ning and the others. He said, "Go." It was time to enter the hall. Ding Ning stood up, but unlike before he moved, he looked at everyone and said seriously, "Take care." Junior sect brother, Mr. Geng said to know when to advance and when to retreat. If it is not possible, do not force it. Zhang Yi suddenly became nervous. He hesitated and said, "You have to leave the hall alive." Any outstanding cultivator is the Holy One's valuable asset. But this passage is not the final one-on-one fight. Even if injuries are unavoidable, Min Mountain Sword Sect will not let us die so easily. Ding Ning shook his head and said, "I just want you to remember that you have been poisoned by the 7-leaf powder. Remember to only use 70% of your power. Also, even if you do not want to give up, you have to pay attention to your injuries. Do not let your injuries affect your future cultivation." Zhang Yi wanted to say the same to you, but looking at the dots of white at Ding Ning's hair and the glow under Ding Ning's skin, he could not say the words. Ding Ning turned and walked towards the green hall. What he really wanted to say at this time was that they really didn't need to force themselves, because he really didn't need their help. However, he knew very well that sometimes friends wouldn't think about whether their help was meaningful or not, but would try their best to help as much as possible. Just like in the bloody storm 3 years before the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne, some people knew what they did was meaningless but still did it. At this time, the best thing to do was to accept and not refuse. It didn't take long for Ding Ning and the others to arrive in front of the Cyan Hall. Dozens of stone steps led to the tightly shut green stone door. The stone steps and door were covered in thick moss. When Ding Ning stepped onto the first stone step, the green stone door that was 2 people tall slowly opened. A burst of mist came out and wet Ding Ning's face. The chaotic sounds inside suddenly became clear. It was like there was a waterfall inside, hitting rocks and plants of different heights and giving off all kinds of water sounds. It was pitch black and no light came out. The mist was so thick that it was impossible to see what was inside. Ding Ning did not stop and quietly walked to the door. There seemed to be a very long passage. inside. Many lines of water poured down from above. I cannot sense it, so I have to go in to know what it is. I will go in first. Ding Ning turned and said softly to Xie Changsheng and the others. Then he walked into the darkness ahead. Xie Changsheng opened his mouth, but before he could make a sound, Ding Ning's figure had already disappeared from his sight. I will go in second. This feeling made Xie Changsheng feel a little uncomfortable, although after hearing Geng Ren's explanation of the Cyan Hall, he had been feeling a chill run down his spine. But at this time, he still took the lead and stepped into the mist ahead of Zhang Yi and Chen Yi. In his mind, the ground in front of him would at most be a little slippery, and he would have to be a little careful when stepping on it. However, what he didn't expect was that the moment he took a step, his body had already lost its balance, and his entire body directly fell and fell. There was nothing under his feet. The passage that seemed to exist from the outside did not exist. Countless water droplets and noisy noises hit his body. The whistling wind was like countless pairs of cold hands slashing across his skin. The blood in his body rushed to his brain like a tide, as if it was going to rip open the top of his head. Every feeling was reminding Xie Zhangsheng that he was really falling. It was as if he was falling from the top of a waterfall into a deep pool below the waterfall. Would he not fall to his death? If there really was a deep pool and a torrent below, who could guarantee fairness? Wouldn't the luckier ones not hit rocks, and the unluckier ones be seriously injured? After the initial pause, Xie Changsheng wanted to shout angrily. Who was so perverse to set up such a competition? But he was unable to shout a word. Dong, a loud sound was heard. At this time, he had fallen on a hard object. The great pain and the impact of blood almost made him vomit. Whoosh! He felt his body was like a slippery fish, quickly sliding down this hard object. The sound of water seemed to be close, but he did not hit the surface. His anger was finally overtaken by an uncontrollable fear, and a shocked cry came out of his mouth. When he cried out in shock, a dazzling light had already appeared in front of his eyes. Phew! He felt himself fly out of the light with a gust of air and mist. In the next moment, the outside was dazzling. With another bang, he fell to the ground again. His vision darkened, and he almost fainted. The sun shone on the brambles by the stream. The deep red brambles were waist-high and moved with the wind like a deep red tide. Xie Changsheng coughed and gasped as he climbed up from the brambles with difficulty. After several breaths, Xie Changsheng, who had many small wounds on his body from the brambles, finally saw his surroundings. In the next moment, he roared angrily, "Who is so perverse? Who is it?" Chapter 249. This was a plain covered in waist-high crimson brambles. The branches of these crimson brambles were very thin, only a fraction of the thickness of a pinky finger, so they swayed gently in the wind like waves. However, these thin crimson brambles had long thorns that were hard and easy to break. Xie Changsheng, who had fallen into one of them, not only had many wounds on his body, there were also many of these thorns that had broken in his flesh. Perhaps it was because of the magic formation, but the plain, which was covered with waist-high crimson thorns, looked boundless, like a crimson ocean. Only in the far distance, where it seemed like it would take days to reach, there were a few tall green palaces. The sunlight was blinding, and there was warmth when it fell on his body. It was very real. While just now he had fallen in the dark mist and could not see the surroundings, Xie Changsheng was certain that he had fallen from a high place, and then rushed down a tunnel or a cave to reach this place. It had not been long. So this plain should be somewhere in Skyscraper Ridge, or an empty valley at the foot of a mountain. But in his instincts, it was more likely to be inside Skyscraper Ridge. In the records of many cultivation manuals, Many powerful sects in ancient times would first choose a spirit vein as their base. Over time, they would carve the mountain they resided in as if it were made of jade. They would set up matrices based on the mountains, rivers, and winds, or hollow out the mountain, or dig out a huge underground palace, or even a plain. These places were either used to store spirit chi, or to train and cultivate, or to grow crops, or to serve as various storehouses. After many sects went through great changes and perished, these places would occasionally survive until the later generations, becoming what later generations of cultivators called hidden relics and hidden treasures. A place like this was shocking enough for all the present cultivators of Changling, but what infuriated Xie Changyan was that there was a winding stream flowing in the brambles next to him, less than 10 feet from where he had fallen. Since they were both falling from above, it was naturally much better to fall into the stream than to fall into the thorny bushes. Yet the person who had set this up had him fall straight into the brambles. So vile. It's like seeing a person who is extremely thirsty and not giving him water to drink, but putting the water in front of him and then tying his hands and feet to prevent him from drinking. Too vicious. Looking at the stream flowing quietly in front of him, Xie Changsheng cursed the person who had set up this sword trial. But in the end, he could not endure the pain caused by the countless thorns in his flesh. He started to pull out the thorns with a twisted expression. Many people had the experience of having a thorn pierced into their hand. As long as the thorn was pulled out, the pain would quickly disappear and be forgotten. However, if it was not pulled out, the pain would continue, especially when it came into contact with that area. It would cause an even more intense pain. After a long time, the flesh and blood of the thorn might even become red, swollen, and festering. The thorns in the flesh had to be pulled out. However, falling from the sky into this thicket of thorns, who knew how many thorns had pierced into Xie Changsheng's skin and flesh? How could he possibly pull them all out in such a short time? Finally, after the time it took for an incense stick to burn, Xie Changsheng chose to give up. He once again let out an angry roar. "Do you know how painful this is? You came up with such an idea. Why don't you try it yourself?" Xie Changsheng's angry shout spread far in the deep red brambles sea and did not bring any echo. Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, and the others should have entered this deep red brambles sea by now, but they seemed to have been completely swallowed and could not be seen. There were no hints. Where should they go next? According to normal thinking, the distant green palaces should have the answer or the exit to pass this trial. But if the green palaces were just a diversion and everything could not be deduced according to common sense, then so what? It was not easy to travel through this sea of brambles. After shouting angrily, Xie Changsheng calmed down with a black face. He silently examined the surrounding brambles. There were no signs of abnormalities in these brambles. Because this plain was covered by the deep red brambles, even if there was a path in the distance, it could not be seen. Even the stream in front of him was hidden in the sea of crimson brambles after meandering for a while in his line of sight. Xie Changsheng was never a person lacking in courage. He used a short time to make a decision. He walked towards the stream in front of him. So, ignorant. When his feet stepped into the cool water of the stream, Jing Liuli gave such an evaluation. Her eyes, which sparkled like colored glass, clearly showed her displeasure. As the organizer of this event, she and the green-robed man, who gave off-sword essence, were on a cliff behind Xie Changsheng. This cliff went up, the top endlessly piercing into the dazzling light as though it was melting into the sun. There was a long and narrow crack beneath her body, from which the sound of water vapor could be heard. Water vapor and air currents were constantly gushing out, and then they were shattered by several layers of gentle power, blown upwards, and evenly dispersed across the vast crimson wilderness. The cliff she was on was completely blocked off by the formation. Xie Changsheng could not sense the existence of this cliff or her. Even if he knew, he could not break through the power of the formation and get close. However, she could clearly hear Xie Changsheng's angry roars. Walking in the stream is naturally easier than walking in the brambles. However, since you fell into the brambles from the beginning, you should naturally understand that such a layout is to make it difficult for you. As long as you are a little smarter, you will definitely feel that there is danger in the stream as well. Also, there are so many thorns in your body. If your wounds are not treated and soaked in water, it will be easier to fester and rot. Before this, she didn't have any judgment about Xie Zhangsheng, but after saying that he was really ignorant, she couldn't help but say a few more words. Hearing her words, the green-robed young man smiled slightly and said, "He does not know that this sea of brambles was a test every Min Mountain Sword sect disciple had to pass, and naturally has such complaints. The men of Guanzhong are straightforward, but after junior sect Brother Qing took this sea of brambles, it has been sealed for 10 years. What did junior sect Brother Qing do in here?" Jing Liuli did not answer directly and said, "You will see later." The green-robed young man grimaced and said, "Is it appropriate to just throw them here without any warning?" Jing Liuli turned to look at him and said, "If they only need to consider survival, they do not need to think of anything else. It is not important if there are any warnings." The green-robed young man stilled and said, "It is best if they don't kill." Jing Liuli's expression darkened and said, "If they are too stupid and seek death, no one can stop them." There was a gentle stream in front of Ding Ning. He had fallen just 10 feet from this stream. His body was pierced with many thorns that were longer and harder than the thorns of the cactus. However, compared to Xie Changsheng's rage, his state of mind was extremely calm. This kind of physical pain was nothing compared to some of the physical and mental pain he had experienced. Unlike Xie Changsheng and the others, while he had never entered Min Mountain Sword sect, he had a great understanding of the sect. Based on the speed of their fall in the darkness and the approximate time, this deep red plain should be deep in the belly of Skyscraper Ridge. So this should be the legendary farm of Min Mountain Sword sect's Qin Yaoyin, because the master of this generation of Min Mountain Sword sect and some people of the Bazin Kendo ground had sworn not to interact. Min Mountain Sword sect did not contribute in the final battles between the Qin dynasty and the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties. They closed their doors for many years and did not even get involved in the 3 most chaotic and bloody years of Chongling. So many of the best and strongest Min Mountain Sword sect cultivators were able to cultivate in peace in Min Mountain Sword sect and grow stronger. In the end, Min Mountain Sword sect and the Lingshu Sword Gate became the strongest sword sect in the world. However, in this sect that used the sword, there were also some powerful outliers. For example, the Chef Gungren, who might be the strongest poison grandmaster in the world. This Qin Yaoyin was one of them. He was most skilled in farming, but what he raised were not ordinary birds and beasts. The legends said that he could raise many strange insects and beasts and make them form a unique food chain. At the top of this food chain, there would be things that were useful to cultivators. They could be beasts that cultivators could control, or monsters that could produce treasures useful to cultivators. The treasures produced by these beasts or monsters were as useful as gods or demons to ordinary cultivators. So even in Min Mountain Sword sect, Qin Yaoyin had a nickname, the Demon Breeder. Min Mountain Sword sect had once opened several farms for him. The largest of these farms was a plain deep in Skyscraper Ridge. It had once been the training ground of Min Mountain Sword sect's disciples, and the deep red plain he was on now, according to the exact information Ding Ning had obtained. This place had been sealed for many years. Then what kind of unique world had this farm become? Chapter 250. The stream water was not poisonous and had a hint of the refreshing sweetness of mountain spring water. The temperature was also very suitable. Even if one walked in it, it would only be slightly cold and would not be uncomfortable. Ding Ning slowly stood up by the stream and wiped the water from the corner of his mouth. He knew that this stream was very dangerous, because this stream was too calm. No matter how clean the stream was, as long as there was no problem with the water quality, even if there were no big fish, there would be some small fish, shrimp, and insects. However, there was nothing in the stream other than the ordinary blue water grass at the bottom. There seemed to be no other living things in this stream. But after thinking silently for a long time, Ding Ning still stepped into the stream ahead and started to walk. I originally thought that he was different from these people, but I did not expect him to be so reckless. Seeing Ding Ning make the same choice, Jing Liuli shook her head in disappointment and said in a cold voice. The green-robed man behind her also shook his head and said, "My view is different from yours." Jing Liuli frowned slightly. "What is your different view?" The green-robed man with sword essence looked at her and said, "He fought for first in all the previous rounds, so he naturally has to fight for first in this round. Yi Haoran and the others will enter soon. So he is walking this path, not because he is reckless, but because he wants to save time." Jing Liuli's eyes flashed fiercely. Then she nodded and said, "I think you are right, but he is too conceited. Being too conceited sometimes equates to being stupid." She paused for a moment before adding another sentence. Hearing her words, the green-robed man smiled slightly. He thought, all the true geniuses in the world are extremely conceited. Are you not the same? The sunlight was still very dazzling. After the body's skin had completely gotten used to the temperature of the stream, the gentle water flow actually had a certain analgesic effect. Xie Zhangxing's attention had been focused on the crimson brambles on both sides of the stream. The water in the stream was not too deep, and the brambles on both sides were only knee-deep. However, compared to the brambles on both sides, one's body would undoubtedly be shorter, and one's vision would be even more obstructed. It would be even more impossible to see the situation in the distance. This meant that if there were any changes, they would only discover them when they were nearby. If you've arranged something, can't you make it appear sooner? Do you find it interesting to look at us like that? If you really think it's interesting, then you're really a pervert. Xie Zhangsheng continued to curse from time to time. Compared to other cultivators, he was even less patient. Most importantly, he was already extremely exhausted. Even with the soothing effect of the gentle water, the thorny wounds still sent waves of intense pain into his mind with every step he took. This kind of continuous and intense pain would consume more of one's physical and mental strength. In the past, he would have to walk for 12 to 12 hours before he would feel unusually tired. But now, this feeling of extreme exhaustion came at least 6 hours early. Under extreme exhaustion, a person's attention would unconsciously decrease, especially since his attention was mostly on the brambles on both sides. So when a strange ripple appeared in the calm stream ahead of him, he did not detect it at all. Many moving shadows appeared under the ripples. These shadows were very fast. Because they were fast and dense, when these shadows approached Xie Zhangsheng, who had not been alert before, even subconsciously felt the sky darken. So his first reaction was to look up at the sky. Such an idiot! Jing Liuli's gaze had stopped on Xie Zhangsheng dozens of breaths ago. When she saw Xie Zhangsheng's first reaction, she sneered and cursed. At the same time, her left hand moved slightly. A crimson short flute suddenly appeared in her left palm. The difference between life and death in the world of cultivators was in an instant. When Xie Zhangsheng raised his head, in her eyes, it had already been several moments. So Xie Zhangsheng's reaction was enough for him to die many times over. The green-robed man beside her was already frowning deeply, with a solemn expression. However, when he saw the flute in her hand that was made from red coral, he was completely relieved. Xie Zhangsheng's head had not yet fallen. The sound of water splashing could be heard all around him. The tranquil stream exploded in an instant. Dense black shadows either passed through the bottom of the water or directly rushed out of the water, swarming toward Xie Zhangsheng. Even now, Xie Zhangsheng still had not seen what these black shadows were, but he felt instinctively terrified. He was so shocked that all the pain in his body seemed to disappear. Only his scalp was numb and about to explode. A stream of water mixed with large amounts of sand and shattered water grass exploded under him. This was his vital energy surging unconsciously towards his feet. At the same time, his right hand gripped the sword hilt in front of him at the fastest speed in his life. However, at this time, several of the fastest black shadows had already landed on his body. Among them, 2 of them landed on the arm that he used to draw his sword with. A shrill scream came from Xie Zhangsheng's mouth. Blood spurted out of his body and arms at the same time. The front of the black shadows carried fresh flesh and gave off excited squeaks. Only now did Xie Zhangsheng, with his head bowed, see that these black shadows were large black rats. These black rats were not ordinary rats. They usually moved in the water for long periods of time. Their black fur was extremely smooth and stuck to their bodies. Even their wide tails were tightly wrapped in black fur. It was impossible for ordinary rodents to be so ferocious and brutal. When the smell of fresh blood and flesh spread out, the entire stream in front of Xie Zhangsheng exploded. It was as if countless arrows had instantly fallen into the water, but countless black shadows swept up, forming a black tide that emitted a crazy aura. Jing Liuli's fingertips were flowing with vital energy into the red flute in her hand. But at this moment, her brows furrowed deeply, and she stopped all her actions. Xie Zhangsheng, who had given a shrill scream, finally swung his sword. A lonely sword light slashed at the crazy black tide ahead. It looked like a weak candle flame that would be extinguished by the oncoming wind at any time. Even Xie Zhangsheng himself felt the arrival of death. He felt that in the next moment, his body would be covered in these black, vicious rats, and then his body would be riddled with holes, revealing white bones. Whoosh! However, what he did not expect was that there was a sudden sound of agitation in the air. This sound caused Xie Zhangsheng to immediately think of the swords of the Zhao sword furnace, because this sound was very similar to the sound of hot fire gushing out of a furnace. Then, in the next moment, his miserable cries came to an abrupt end, and his eyes widened to the extreme. Within the white misty sword energy, countless golden lines of fire suddenly appeared, and these golden lines of fire completely ignited the white misty sword energy. In front of him, a burning golden cloud swept out like the legendary phoenix's tail. Countless sharp and short screams came out of the burning golden clouds. Xie Zhangsheng's body had already flown up and landed in the brambles on the side. His legs and body were pierced by many thin thorns, but he did not feel any pain at this time. He was in great shock and disbelief. The burning golden clouds swept across the surface of the stream, and all the bodies of the black rats were burning. One could clearly see that their black hair was instantly burned off, and their muscular bodies were burned into a golden yellow color. There were even drops of yellow oil seeping out of their bodies. Why was it like this? How could this sword strike ignite such a golden cloud? And how could it sweep a distance of several tens of feet? Xie Zhangxing's breathing stopped. His gaze instinctively fell to the sword in his hand. He saw the sword in his hand give off a glowing light. Many golden lines of light seemed to float out of the sword. Only then did he realize that he was not using the sword he usually used, but the sword Ding Ning insisted on him choosing. The brilliant light sword combined with the white cloud sex, white cloud sword essence, and the stimulation of energies can cause such a change. Jing Liuli's eyes reflected the golden light. She narrowed her eyes and seemed to ask the indigo-robed man behind her, but also seemed to be talking to herself. True shock appeared in the indigo-robed man's eyes. He said seriously, "I do not know. You are the person in Min Mountain Sword Sect who has read sword manuals and swords the most. I do not think that Forefather Zhou knows more than you. Even you do not know, but Ding Ning knows. Is this a coincidence?" Jing Liuli turned and said to the indigo-robed man, "Maybe Forefather Zhou just happened to know. Maybe he read some records from other dynasties. Other than these coincidences, I cannot think of any other possibilities," the indigo-robed man said with a grimace. Jing Liuli put away the red flute in her hand. Her gaze landed on Xie Zhangsheng in the deep red plains. Displeasure appeared in her eyes again. She said coldly, "You got lucky with this sword." When she said this, Xie Zhangsheng did not feel lucky at all. The threat of death he sensed had not disappeared. The deaths of the rats did not intimidate the other rats. The wild black tide was still charging out of the stream towards him. At the same time, he sensed an unusual throbbing from further away. Chapter 2:51. Xie Zhangxing instinctively felt fear. He felt like a tiny gopher in the wasteland when he sensed the strange movement coming from the dark red sea of thorns. He didn't know if the strange movement was a wildfire or an earthquake that shook the earth. He had multiple lacerations on his body, especially the 2 wounds on his right arm. The pain caused him to feel dizzy, but he had no choice. He could only continue to attack. So he took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and swung his sword again against the crazed flood of water rats. The sword move was still the white cloud sword move of Baiyun Monastery. As he swung his sword, the sword light formed unique seal lines in the air. Large amounts of primal energies of the universe were sucked in, forming a soft white cloud like sword energy. Just like the previous attack, countless golden rays of light came out of the transparent sword. These golden rays of light did not have any temperature, but when they landed on the soft white cloud like sword energy, it was like countless threads of fire falling into hot oil. They immediately ignited the white cloud like sword energy, burning and surging forward. The white cloud sword essence was the secret sword of Baiyun Monastery that combined attack and defense. It was one of the best sword manuals in Baiyun Monastery. Originally, with Xie Changxing's cultivation, he could only cover about 10 feet of space in front of him. But when the burning golden light swept out close to the ground, it immediately covered a distance of 50 feet. All the black rats in the space in front of him disappeared, turning into balls of buttery meat that fell into the water. This scene gave Xie Changxing a great deal of confidence. He took a deep breath again, trying to make himself as clear-headed as possible. Then he swung his sword forward again. There was a tearing sound. Using the time he had won with this attack, Xie Changxing stuck the brilliant light sword in front of him. He tore several pieces of cloth from his robes and quickly wrapped them around the bleeding wound on his right arm. Then he gritted his teeth, reached out with his right hand, and gripped the hilt of the brilliant light sword. There seemed to be a strange fire burning in his eyes. Even the crazy black rats that were stimulated by the smell of meat and fresh blood felt fear, and they all retreated. A new tide appeared in the stream. The frightening disturbance from the distance was approaching. Xie Changsheng stopped. His breathing paused slightly. The black tide formed by the group of black rats retreated and collided with the new tide several hundred feet away from him. The new tide was originally clear and transparent, with a layer of white foam on the surface. However, the moment the tide collided with the black tide, the white foam on the surface turned into the color of scarlet blood. A thick smell of blood spread out from the stream. The sound of countless sharp teeth crunching bones could be heard from under the water. The initial madness of the black rats turned into panic. Countless black rats jumped up, wanting to escape the stream and jump to the banks on both sides. However, countless streaks of silver light shot out from the stream below at the same time, catching up to these large black rats. Xie Changsheng didn't need to attack anymore. All the black rats had become the prey. They had no time to care about his existence, but he didn't dare to put down the sword in his hand. The streaks of silver light coming out of the stream were all small silver, lizard-like beasts. Their appearance was different from ordinary lizards in that they had gills like fish. At a glance, one could see that they could breathe underwater. Their thin teeth looked short and not sharp, but that was the case if they wanted to tear and chew flesh as quickly as possible. These teeth had to grind quickly at this moment in Xie Changsheng's eyes. The speed at which these small silver lizard-like beasts bit was even faster than an ordinary swordsman's sword. The shaking of their heads and the tearing between their teeth even brought out unreal afterimages. This kind of speed caused a black rat that had jumped out of the water a moment ago to have a complete body, but in the next moment, this black rat only had a stump left. Xie Changsheng instinctively wanted to flee. However, the fragments of images captured by his eyes made him stop again. Some small silver, lizard-like beasts with bulging bellies climbed onto the banks on both sides of the stream. These small beasts that had eaten their fill at an astounding speed started to sleep. Silver cracks appeared on their bodies, and they were shedding their skin at a speed visible to the naked eye. As they molted, their limbs also seemed to wither. They were clearly quickly turning into another form of being, or rather, maturing. But at this time, Xie Changsheng heard many rustling sounds. These sounds came from the deep red brambles on both sides of the stream. Xie Changsheng's body grew cold again. He instinctively took a few steps towards the water. Many deep red worms burrowed out of the soil and appeared next to the small silver beasts that were molting. These deep red worms looked like earthworms, but when they got close to the molting silver beasts, they all opened their mouths. Their mouths looked large and soft without teeth, but the scene of them slowly wrapping around the molting silver beasts and swallowing them into their stomachs was exceptionally terrifying. These shedding silver beasts had no ability to resist at all, while the silver beasts in the stream were still hunting the black rats. They tore the black rats into pieces, chewed the bones, and swallowed them into their stomachs. Then they walked to the shore and began to shed their skin. They were then swallowed by the dark red worms that drilled out. These small silver beasts seemed to be willing to be eaten by these deep red worms. They seemed to be the food that these deep red worms grazed. Xie Changsheng's face grew paler. In his perception, waves of energy formed in the stomachs of these feeding deep red worms. He started to see white frost appear on the sides of these deep red worms' mouths, and then ice. This was a rapid evolution process that he could not understand. These deep red worms were like cultivators who cultivated by eating spirit medicines, and were accumulating special primal energies of the universe in their bodies. The black rats became the food of the small silver beasts, and then the small silver beasts became the food of these deep red worms. The deep red worms started to become beasts that possessed some kind of ice power. This process appeared in front of Xie Changsheng at an astounding speed. As his hands grew colder, Xie Changsheng found that he had become the initial bait. The presence of his blood became the initial bait that started this process. What will these things become? On the cliff, where Xie Changsheng could not see, the eyes of the green-robed man behind Jing Liuli flashed with shock. He was shocked at the methods of Qing Yaoyin, who had managed this farm for more than a decade. There were many beasts in the world that could control primal energies of the universe, like cultivators, such as the flame tortoises in the desert, the ice-winged serpents in the desert, the ice serpents in the cold ponds, and the demon octopuses in the deep sea. Yet these beasts that were like cultivators among ordinary beasts had evolved naturally through countless generations. Most of them had the ability to use primal energies of the universe because they were in extreme environments and in the process of adapting to the outside world. In such a short amount of time, the beasts that originally could not use the primal energies of the universe became strange beasts that could use the primal energies of the universe. It was like forcibly turning groups of ordinary people who could not cultivate into cultivators in an extremely short amount of time. Was this something that could be done by human power? Yet it was happening in front of his eyes. Sect Uncle Qing calls these black ice worms. The black ice energy they spit out can turn into icicles, like the ice swords cultivators use. Jing Liuli turned to glance at the green-robed man and said slowly, "Even more importantly, these black ice worms will produce some black ice beads that can be used to make pills." The green-robed man was speechless. He took a deep breath. His gaze moved away from Xie Changsheng and landed in front of Ding Ning. Ding Ning was walking in a similar stream at this time. In the distance in front of Ding Ning, a black tide started to appear. The black tide was formed from an astounding number of black rats. He also had to face the same process of evolution. It was just that he had to go through this process later than Xie Zhangsheng. He should have found something wrong. The green-robed man saw that Ding Ning had stopped moving. Ding Ning's gaze seemed to be looking in the direction of the black tide, but Ding Ning did not leave the stream. So he was puzzled. He is very confident in facing such an unusual situation. He did not choose any sword in the Sword Valley. He looked at the waiting Ding Ning and suddenly thought of a question. What sword is he using? Jing Liuli's eyebrows rose slightly. He said in a strange voice, "It is the last flower sword." The green-robed man's body shook. He had a shocked expression. "Last flower sword. It is too incomplete, so even you did not see it," Jing Liuli said slowly. The green-robed man did not speak. His eyes flashed with an unusual light. Ding Ning stood silently in the stream. In his perception, countless strands of turbulence had already appeared in the calm stream. He waited for the black tide to come closer. When the water started to ripple and the black shadows started to splash, vital energy started to flow out of his hand that gripped the sword hilt. The short remnant sword suddenly lit up, and countless fine white flowers bloomed. The body of the broken sword spread out along with the countless fine and straight cracks, extending and lengthening. In the water in front of him, there seemed to be a tuft of long hair floating. The black rats at the front seemed to have hit a wall of death. Their bodies were penetrated by sword threads. These sword threads did not stop and continued to stab backwards, and then through the bodies of the black rats behind them. She was not convinced even by many people of the Bazin Kendo ground, and even the master of the last flower sword. But when she heard the green-robed man's words, she did not express any objections and remained silent. The threads with the white flowers reaped the lives of the black rats even faster than the burning golden clouds. But this cold and silent harvest did not make the rats feel instinctive terror like the heat and light of the flames. The black rats behind were still surging towards Ding Ning. It seemed that this black tide would not stop unless they were all killed by the sword threads. Yet Ding Ning did not want to endlessly expend his precious vital energy. The vital energy that had been flowing out of his hand suddenly stopped for a moment. As his vital energy output stopped, the wandering sword threads started to contract and gather together. The scattered sword threads gathered together and turned into a sword. The rat corpses that had been strung together by the sword threads pressed against each other as they were cut. In a flash, they exploded into irregular pieces. The stream in front of Ding Ning that had been sticky from the bloody water seemed to become a boiling porridge. All the black rats at the back suddenly realized that their movements had slowed down. The reason for this was that they felt as if they had crawled into an extremely sticky porridge pot. Then, in the next moment, they saw pieces of flesh and blood of their own kind floating in front of them and pressing against them. They finally felt instinctive terror. They started to furiously retreat, forming a retreating black tide. Ding Ning calmly looked up at the back of the black tide. Just like what Xie Zhangsheng had encountered, a silver tide appeared behind the black tide, and then created a chaotic wave of blood. Countless small silver, lizard-like beasts quickly ate these strange rats. Then a large portion of them climbed up the two sides of the stream and started to shed their skin. Their limbs started to wither as though they were about to transform into another form. Yet many red sandworms came out of the brambles on the two sides and started to consume these small silver beasts. Their bodies started to give birth to cold energy. This was an unnatural transformation, an unimaginable scene. But in this process, Ding Ning did not move and just watched calmly. He didn't even take a step onto the stream bank. He allowed the filthy and smelly water to wash over his body until the stream became clear again. Why hasn't he left? The green-robed man behind Jing Liuli frowned in puzzlement. At this point, Xie Zhangsheng had already escaped while the red sandworms were still mutating. If Han Sun had been in his shoes, he would have either fled as quickly as Xie Zhangsheng had, or he would have killed as many of the red sandworms as he could while they were still mutating. If these black rats were equivalent to ordinary warriors of the world, then these red sandworms after the transformation were equivalent to cultivators of the world. The two were fundamentally different. In his view, even if Ding Ning was confident he could kill all the black ice worms after the transformation, Ding Ning would pay a great price. Jing Liuli shook her head. She did not understand what Ding Ning was doing right now. This was Min Mountain Sword Sect, and she was the perverted strategist that Xie Zhangsheng spoke of. She had set up all of this, but Ding Ning had puzzled her time and time again. When she looked at the other young geniuses participating in the trials, she judged them as stupid and useless. She stood in the position of an examiner and looked at these people with a selective gaze. But Ding Ning gave her a completely different feeling. He was like a riddle. In many aspects, Jing Liuli felt she was not as good as Ding Ning. While Ding Ning's cultivation was still low in her view, he gave her an indescribable pressure. Before this, only in Baosher of Lingshu Sword Gate could give her such pressure. Regardless of what he wants to do with his performance, he qualifies to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate, Jing Liuli said after a moment of silence. The green-robed man nodded slightly in agreement. Jing Liuli slowly looked up and said coldly, "But he still must follow the rules of the trials and win." The green-robed man looked at her profile and smiled slightly. Rules were rules, especially when this was a trial that faced the entire Qin dynasty. Naturally, they could not open the door to just one person, but Jing Liuli's words once again expressed her hope. She hoped that Ding Ning could win. As the teacher responsible for giving her guidance on her cultivation, he naturally hoped that someone like Ding Ning, who could give her some true pressure, could enter Min Mountain Sword sect to cultivate. All the little silver beasts entered a state of deep sleep and shedding after eating. The two sides of the stream were silver, and then slowly became sparse under the consumption of the red sandworms. The black frost energy in these red sandworms grew stronger. At the start, only the black frost energy was spat out of the corners of their mouths to form ice. But as time passed, the ice formed from the cold energy gradually covered their entire bodies. The originally ordinary-looking red sandworms seemed to be covered in a layer of ice armor, and because the shape of the ice was irregular and uneven, the red sandworms suddenly looked ferocious and ferocious. As the number of little silver beasts in front of them decreased, these long worms covered in ice finally noticed the existence of Ding Ning, who was calmly wading in the stream. A long worm very close to Ding Ning hesitantly opened its mouth. A ball of cold energy gathered in its mouth. It did not open its mouth quickly, but this ball of cold energy gathered as quickly as a cultivator's sword. There was a cracking sound. This cold energy turned into a foot-long icicle that shot towards Ding Ning's chest in a cold light. Ding Ning looked at this cold light and swung his sword. With a crack, the icicle shattered on his sword, covered in fine white flowers. Many pieces of ice fell into the stream in front of him. The sword trembled slightly. Ding Ning's brow furrowed slightly. The power of this attack had slightly surpassed his expectations. But he did not pause in his movements. After blocking this icicle, a new wave of vital energy flowed into his last flower remnant sword. Then the last flower remnant sword steadily swung forward. Cold-killing intent appeared in the air. A white sword seal formed and then turned into a patch of white sword energy that swept towards the shore in front of his sword. More than a dozen long worms were enveloped in this sword chi. The ice armor on their bodies suddenly cracked open, and then their flesh was cut open, turning into dozens of pieces of meat that spread out. Still want to kill? The green-robed man behind Jing Liuli gave a soft sound of surprise. At this time, Ding Ning's minute movement attracted his attention. Ding Ning first looked closely at the reactions of these black ice worms and then looked up in a direction in the distance. In the distance, there seemed to be another unusual movement in the deep red brambles. He purposefully waited for these black ice worms to finish changing before killing them to see if they will attract something else. The green-robed man's brow furrowed deeply. He could not help but say, "But it is already difficult to deal with these black ice worms. If something more powerful appears, isn't he putting himself in an even more disadvantageous situation?" You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.